Welcome to something special. Welcome to TEDx. This TEDx event is part of a global conversation that takes place every day in every corner of the world. In schools, in theaters, in workplaces, even in prisons, people gather to hear the best ideas bubbling up in their communities. More than 3,000 TEDx events are held every year in 170 countries. It's a remarkable thing. TEDx events are self-organized under a license from TED, a non-profit organization devoted to discovering and sharing powerful ideas in the form of TED Talks. It's not TED itself, but your local TEDx team of volunteers that has done all the work to put on today's event, including booking all of the speakers. It's this team's ideas, dedication, and time that have made this possible. We really hope today's program sparks an exciting conversation. This is a day for curiosity and for skepticism, for inspiration and for action. The more you enter into it, the more you will take out. And now, on with the show.
Good morning. Welcome to TEDxJohannesburgSalon, Surviving Pandemics. It's the 3rd of December, and we're glad that you made the time to connect and share this day with us. I'm co-hosting the event with Itateng Mokoro, and later on my other colleague, Rosh Mamabolo, will join us. So, on the 11th of March, the World Health Organization declared the novel coronavirus a pandemic. In an effort to contain the spread, a lot of countries implemented a set of measures, of which lockdown or stay-at-home orders have been, I think, the most consequential. We, as a global community, had to start learning new things. We had to quickly adapt, with the real effort being to contain the virus, and hopefully at some point, then we can go back to a form of new normal. Today, we have put together a list of 16 speakers who have in the past 9 months really lived through the pandemic, worked in different spaces, and they're here to share some insights, to offer some lessons, some guides. We want to talk about the challenges that you face, that we faced as a community, and hopefully this will help us in preparing for the next pandemic. Our list of speakers, the sessions are broken down into two. Session 1 will be between now and 12:30, and session 2 will be from 12:45 to 14:15. We've added a little bit of Q&A at the end with some of the speakers, and we suggest that if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A or in the chat. If you are following us on Facebook or on Twitter, do the same. We also want to hear from you. What have your experiences been? As a team, we go and curate these conversations, but we obviously do not reach everybody. So if you have some interesting things to share, do comment on our social media pages. Just some housekeeping. We want to thank two organizations, TED and the Skoll Foundation, for making this event possible. TED in New York, the global TEDx team has been working hard to make sure that the TEDx communities around the world survive. And we are one of 4 events that are hosting conversations around the pandemic. The first event is in Brazil, in Sao Paulo. The second event being here, TEDx Johannesburg. The third one being TEDx Port Harcourt in Nigeria. And the last one being TEDx Bangalore in India. For me, as a TEDx organizer, I'm really appreciative of this opportunity, particularly because these are all TEDx's in the Global South. So for the Johannesburg leg of the event, we'd like to start off with our hashtags for the day, surviving pandemics, and obviously TEDx Johannesburg. Okay, now for the program. Our first speaker is someone who spent the last 25 years working as a journalist. And for us, and I think for a lot of us, the information really that we have been receiving on COVID is through the media, all sorts of media, mainstream media, social media, and television. And we reached out to one of the media houses here in Johannesburg to really hear from them what they have learned and some insights that they can share with us. Welcome to the TEDx Johannesburg stage, Mia Malan. Hi, Mia. Welcome to the TEDx Johannesburg stage. Thanks for making time to share some insights with us today.
Thanks very much for having me.
Okay, so you are a journalist. Can you tell us a bit about how you end up here?
So I started off as a student studying something very different from journalism. I studied speech therapy and audiology. And while I knew very well from the first year of that course, it was 4 years long, that I didn't want to become a speech therapist. I did want to finish the course. And so I had 4 years to figure out what I wanted to do. And at the university where I studied, you could only study journalism postgraduately. So you had to have a degree in something, and then you would do a year of journalism afterwards. So during those 4 years, I could get to the decision that I wanted to be a journalist. And why a journalist? Because it was hard for me I had many interests, and it was hard for me to pin it down. And journalism was the profession that required me to make the least amount of choices, because you could report on anything in journalism. So you could cover all the fields. And I was very interested in both broadcast and print, and journalism also allowed you to do both of that.
So why health?
So my first job was in the Eastern Cape in Port Elizabeth at the SABC in the radio newsroom. And when you're a junior reporter and you walk into a newsroom, you're certainly not going to be assigned the political stories. Those are for the senior journalists in the room. So health was something I could get into because the senior journalists had been there for a while, and the Eastern Cape health system had been not functioning so well for quite a number of years. So they were tired of those stories, which was an opportunity for me to get into them. And I grew up in Cape Town and had very little exposure to rural areas in the Eastern Cape, and really found it fascinating to travel to those areas, and learned very quickly that health is like a mirror of society. It shows you exactly what society looks like, and it allows you to report on anything. It is the beat that I find that literally allows you to report from gender issues to politics to medical stuff to just how people live.
That's interesting, because this is like 25 years ago, and you mentioned the Eastern Cape, and ironically, today we're talking about COVID, and the Eastern Cape keeps popping up in the news as the province that is struggling with the health system. So obviously you've reported on other epidemics, pandemics, HIV, TB, malaria. So what is different for you with COVID, if anything?
No, there's certainly differences. I think the biggest other epidemic that I've reported on is HIV. And I was a very young reporter when Thabo Mbeki was president and there was HIV denialism. And during those times, if you were a health reporter, you were an AIDS reporter. That's all you did for 3 or 4 years. You just reported on AIDS, and it was a political beat because it had all to do with politics, about a president not acknowledging that HIV causes AIDS, and there wasn't treatment in the country, and the health minister at the time. So two big differences between COVID and AIDS is that the one is a very fast moving epidemic, the other one is slow. COVID moves much faster than HIV, and that means that research comes out at the speed of light and often comes out without being peer reviewed, and it means that what you report on is often not always correct. It's very hard to figure out if that science is correct because it's so fast-tracked. With HIV, that was a bit different. You had more time to figure that out. But in South Africa specifically, one of the biggest differences in reporting on HIV and COVID is the government's response. In the case of COVID, the government has an evidence-based response. Yes, there are many differences in how scientists interpret the science, and they have very healthy and very public arguments about what is the best strategy. But ultimately, it's all based on evidence. No one is saying there isn't COVID, or no one is saying, the coronavirus isn't causing COVID. Where during the HIV time, it was very different. It was a political beat. In the first years, because there was a government that didn't provide evidence-based treatment, because some political leaders didn't believe in it. And that meant that the kind of reporting that you did was very different. It was very much on what the president said and what the health minister said, as opposed to what's the latest scientific treatment that came out, because it wasn't available in the country, but also it was not the focus of reporting. I guess you can compare it a little bit with the United States, with Donald Trump. Their
COVID moment is what was our HIV moment. It actually kind of sounds similar.
Absolutely. And if you look at the US media's reporting on COVID, if someone had to go and count how many reports there are on what Donald Trump said today again, there will be quite a significant part of that reporting, which is what the president said. And in the end, that's not so meaningful, because it's a lot of he said, she said, as opposed to how should we interpret the data to get better treatment? And so I think that's the political side of it when it comes to HIV and COVID are two very different things in South Africa. It doesn't mean that the government is not criticized now. Look at all the corruption, right? I mean, there's a lot of accountability that we need to report on. But the kind of scientific arguments we see in the media and among scientists and the government are of a very different nature than at the beginning stages of HIV.
Is it also, I've learned quite a lot. Before COVID, I kind of had a sense of how research works, the peer-reviewed research papers, the preprints. Is it also that the internet might have contributed to science literacy? Is it, or is it just how open and transparent the government and the science community is?
I think something that COVID undeniably did is that it brought science into our homes. No one even knew what an epidemiologist was, an average person, before this. I remember the chair of our Ministerial Advisory Committee, Salim Abdul Karim, telling a story recently in a webinar saying people thought, he was a dermatologist, a skin specialist, because epidemiologist sounds a little bit like that. And it is now amazing how everyone knows what an epidemiologist does, that he doesn't have to explain what he's doing. And I think, also words like positivity rate, of what's the positivity rate of how many tests that we've done are positive, what proportion, those are things that no one had a clue of previously. So I think also because research is published so quickly and fast-tracked at the moment, and everyone depends on that research for what happens to them tomorrow. Is there treatment? How will I get infected? There's a much greater interest in it, and the media obviously reports on it more. One very big difference in the media with COVID is that overnight, everyone became a health reporter. Whether you were a political or a business journalist didn't matter. All of a sudden, you had to report on science. It doesn't mean that you were necessarily equipped to do that, but you had to do it. And if the entire media only reports on science for 6 months, surely the public is going to be more exposed to it.
So, Mia, thank you so much for this time. Your final thoughts on the new normal coexisting with COVID?
So I think the thing to remember is that, yes, COVID vaccines are becoming available, but there's not going to be enough for everyone for a very long time. So that means our lives are not going to change back to normal, within a year. South Africa is, for instance, only planning to acquire enough vaccines for 5% of our population for next year. So masks are certainly here to stay. I think other diseases like TB can also benefit from them. Hand sanitizers are here to stay. When you look at something like budgets of organizations for offices, at Bhekisisa, we've returned to the office, but we only go twice a week because COVID taught me that people can be more productive when they work from home. And I doubt that very large offices will continue to exist. I think people will still go to offices because you do need that interaction, and that is very beneficial to how you operate. But I think there will be more flexibility, and perhaps budgets may be spent, more towards other things, and the actual office the space might become a bit smaller. And I think we're likely for the next couple of years to socialize differently. I don't think I would want to go to a nightclub.
Definitely not. But yeah, thank you. And all the best with the rest of the year and the next years to come. And hope to see you at some point on a red circle with humans in the room.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay, so my colleague Kabelo forgot to introduce me.
Did.
You did? Yes, you did, but I didn't get to say a word. But my name is Tati Mokoro, or Itate Mokoro. She knows me. I thought there was a fascinating start to the event. Just the idea that even the media landscape has changed. And because of the media, we're having very different discussions. Science has gone a lot deeper into households than it had in the past.
Definitely. I mean, the interview was much longer, so we might post the longer version on our YouTube channel. But I really appreciated the role that the media has been playing during this time. Lockdown, we've all seen the devastating effects that lockdown has on the economy. And I know here in South Africa, there has been lots of discussions about when to stop the lockdown, when to open the economy, which sectors are key, how, all sorts of things. But what has really stuck out for us is what is it that we actually do when we measure progress? Because at the end of the day, this is about measuring human progress, society progress, issues of education, job losses, hunger. And we started looking at, is there another lens that we can put to measuring progress? Our next speaker has spent his life as a social scientist. He has done a lot of work around the issues of how do you measure society's progress. And I'm happy to welcome to the TEDx Johannesburg stage, Shaneel Bachoo.
We are surrounded these days by loads of data, metrics, and information. But as always, this information will only add value if we use it smartly. Let's say, for example, that in the world, you have a simple goal, such as a goal to lose weight. And like many people in the world, you have a smartwatch that feeds you with loads of information about your physical activity. If you decided to monitor one metric, say, for example, your heart rate, how likely are you to achieve your goal of losing weight? Incredibly unlikely, right? But on the other hand, if you decided to monitor a battery of metrics, such as the number of steps achieved, the number of calories consumed, the number of calories burned, and other such metrics, all of a sudden, your chances of achieving your goal start to improve exponentially. Still, you would need to measure your weight on a periodic basis in order to manage it. So there are 2 points that I want to make with respect to using data in order to achieve a goal. The first is that what gets measured gets managed. It's very difficult to manage something that we're not measuring. And the second is that when we bring together data and metrics in a meaningful way, our chances of achieving our goal start to improve significantly. Now let's come back to the pandemic and this unprecedented year. Like many of you, I believe that South Africa could have been better prepared for COVID-19. And one of the things that made me really sad is that the pandemic served to exacerbate the inequality in what is already the most unequal society on the planet. So it occurred to me, what if we use data to manage our way into a more equal society. If we did that, and if we achieved that, it would no doubt mean that the most vulnerable members of our society are benefited and that their quality of life is improved. It would also be a sure way to respond more resiliently to the next pandemic. Now, coming back to this idea of what gets measured gets managed. What metric would we choose to monitor if we were to try and manage our way into a more equal society? The economists, who, by the way, always have an answer to every problem, would probably tell us that the answer lies in boosting the economy. And in accordance with that, the metric that we would need to monitor is GDP, gross domestic product. But here's the problem with that. We have been doing exactly that for the last 86 years, measuring GDP and trying to boost the economy. And look where it has landed us. Do you know why? It's because GDP doesn't care that the rich get richer whilst the poor get poorer. It doesn't care that shareholders gain whilst the ordinary man struggles to feed his family. It doesn't care about whether or not taxpayer money is spent efficiently to benefit society. It doesn't care about climate change or fairness and justice. It cannot measure happiness and well-being. All GDP cares about is the sum total of goods and services sold. My dear South Africans, in an effort to make South Africa a better place, we've been monitoring the wrong metric. And so if we are to deliberately manage our way into a more equal society, we need a new metric. One that takes into account the real things that matter to real people. I have a master's degree in social science, and I've spent my entire career in research. So I know a thing or two about metrics and social progress. What if I told you that there is a tool, a metric, that can provide us with a robust and reliable view of the quality of life of a society, irrespective of the economy? Introducing the Social Progress Index. As you can see, the Social Progress Index has 3 dimensions: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. It answers the real questions that matter to real people. Questions around food, water, shelter, safety, basic education, access to information and communications, health and wellness, environmental quality, rights, freedom and choice, inclusiveness, and higher education. It uses about 50 indicators from reliable sources to provide a robust view of social progress around the world. Now, I'm sure that you are wondering which country is number 1 in social progress. I can tell you that for the 3rd year running, it is Norway, followed by Denmark, Finland, New Zealand, and Sweden making up the top 5. Where is South Africa? Well, I'm afraid you'd have to scroll all the way down to 82nd spot out of 163 countries to find our flag. But here's the interesting thing. Of these top 5 countries, none of them are economic powerhouses. In fact, none of them are in the top 20 of the world's biggest economies measured in nominal GDP. New Zealand, for example, is basically a farm with some really good rugby players. GDP is not destiny, and yet we've made it the most important metric in the world for the last 86 years. And if we look back at the history of GDP, it was originally used to help the United States come out of the Great Depression in the 1930s. But we've since been using it as an indicator for social progress for the last 86 years. Surely, it is time for a measurement revolution. So how is all of this relevant in the context of the pandemic and South Africa? I'd like to use the Eastern Cape as an example to illustrate why it's relevant. On screen, you will see what South Africa looks like from a social progress point of view. A score of 100 indicates optimal levels of social progress, whilst a score of 0 indicates minimal levels of social progress. As you can see, Gauteng and the Western Cape are on top, whilst the Eastern Cape is the worst performing province. Am I starting to convince you that social progress is relevant? No? What if I told you that the Eastern Cape is currently experiencing a spike in COVID-19 infections and deaths? Still not convinced? Let's take one of the Social Progress Index components, water and sanitation. So on screen, you'll see now what South Africa looks like from a water and sanitation point of view. As you'll see, the Eastern Cape is one of the worst performing provinces. I believe that had this view of South Africa from a water and sanitation point of view been created decades ago, perhaps something could have been done by government, civil society, or the private sector to improve the situation and to ensure that the Eastern Cape is not left behind. Instead, we find ourselves in a situation where slightly under a quarter of households in the Eastern Cape do not have access to tap water, and slightly over a quarter of schools in the Eastern Cape still only use pit toilets for sanitation purposes. Still not convinced that social progress matters? Let's take another component from the Social Progress Index, health and wellness, a proxy indicator for the quality of the healthcare system. As you will see, the Eastern Cape is one of the worst performing provinces. I recently read that of the 10 deadliest COVID-19 hospitals in South Africa, 7 of them are located in the Eastern Cape. Again, had this view of South Africa been created decades ago, perhaps someone would have done something to ensure that the Eastern Cape is not left behind. Instead, we currently find ourselves in a situation where the Eastern Cape is experiencing a COVID-19 crisis that is far more acute compared to some of the other provinces in South Africa. Still not convinced that social progress matters? Let's take one more component from the Social Progress Index, access to information and communications, something that I'm sure you would agree is vital during a time like this. Did you know that only 11% of schools in the Eastern Cape have access to the internet, versus 86% in the Western Cape, its neighboring province? Or that slightly under a quarter of households in the Eastern Cape do not have a television set? How would they have watched those all-important addresses by our president this year? In the end, it is clear to me that advancing social progress is the best way for us to respond to the inequality problem. And perhaps equally important, the best way for us to prepare for the next pandemic. If we haven't been accurately measuring social progress, how can we truly say that we've been optimally managing social progress? But the tool to measure and manage social progress is now in our hands. So let's join hands and give future generations of South Africans a better South Africa than the one that was handed to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shaneel. That's such an important index, and I'm hoping that as we move into what is definitely the new normal, we can start to look at some of those metrics and see what is it that we're really measuring and how can we use the index to highlight some of the challenges, as you put it, that our societies face. If you have any questions, comments, please do share them on the chat. Our hashtag again is TEDxJohannesburg, surviving pandemics, and do tell us what your experiences have been with the pandemic. In the early days of the pandemic, I remember every day around between 9 p.m. and sometimes I'd have to wait till midnight to wait for the Minister of Health to announce the latest data on COVID cases. Testing, 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 that's what everybody was talking about. At some point, there was a strain on the capacity of the country, and we started asking ourselves, who actually does these tests? Where do they come from? You know, what are swabs? What are PCR machines? Who has them? Who doesn't? And we went looking for a lab. We were fortunate enough to find what is classified as a level 3 biomedical lab. I think I have that right, based here in Johannesburg. They do most of the testing for the country. They partner with a lot of other labs nationally. And we reached out to Professor Stevens to just tell us a little bit about what is it that they do, and actually what do these tests mean, and what has COVID done for the country, for the continent, in terms of increasing our capacity to test and to do other sorts of interesting science research. Professor Wendy Stevens.
The value of laboratories have never been so spectacularly demonstrated as it has been during the global COVID pandemic. If we're talking about future-proofing laboratories or any process, we're talking about design or change that will continue to be useful or successful into the future, equaling sustainability. So when we do this, we have to make sure whatever we do is simple, can evoke an action, is designed for a purpose with an end in mind. And the chaos around testing globally has certainly not been like that. We do need to work on new tools, new systems, ensure we have multi-purpose platforms, and that our laboratories are connected. So what are the value of laboratories in pandemics? Well, actually, they're the keepers of truth because they manage to keep their data. And two aspects have been critical in this epidemic or pandemic: investment in molecular technologies and in information systems, which have been a long-standing work for the region and the rest of the world. So real barriers still remain, especially on this continent, and that is the absence of certain pieces of equipment. But some of the barriers are self-imposed, and these are political or boundaries. But if we have a look at diagnostics, they're actually easy to innovate and develop at scale in modular fashions. We're moving towards modernization, automation, and integration. And we're also moving to a phase where results and there should be access to information from anywhere and available for all individuals. So what does future-proofing do? It means today we remove the barriers for tomorrow. So if we talk about a laboratory value chain or a pathology value chain, it really starts and ends with the patient. Everyone thinks about the lab and the test. Everyone forgets that the patient needs the specimen collected appropriately. Transport and systems are just as important. So whatever we do needs to start and end with the patient. What is unique to the continent? Perhaps what is unique is the experience that we have with dealing with pandemics in a realistic fashion. By 2050, 1 in 4 of the world's population will be African. And what we do have in our favor is youth and creativity with young populations that are hungry for innovation. And we've learned some hard lessons over the years, over 25 years for laboratories. And that is, to get some of the HIV diagnostics in place took us 25 years. To get some of the TB diagnostics took months to 2 years. To get COVID diagnostics in place took a couple of weeks. And so leapfrogging comes to mind in this continent. With COVID, we were in completely uncharted territory. And because of our early lockdown and the first case being identified as early as the 5th of March, And lockdown 5 occurring in the 27th of March, we really had no planes, no tests, no swabs, no reference materials or guidelines. And so what happened on the 1st of April to me and my team was that we were asked to expand diagnostics in the situation of global shortages. And this has been a really difficult road to travel. And if you have a look, as the lockdown has proceeded, we certainly have improved our processes. But we had to have things in place when the WHO only presented their first set of draft guidelines in July, at the time we were peaking in our epidemic. So what is unique to South Africa? Well, what is unique is that we have 265 public laboratories across the country. We, in fact, do 25% of the world's global HIV molecular tests. And so in the background, we are already doing the types of tests we need, PCRs, at the rates of 10 million. When COVID came along, we now had to add these to an already burdened system. To date, we have done over 5 million tests with about 775,000 of them positive. What's really important about diagnostics, and there's some serious considerations that people don't understand, and I think the diagram I have here presents them very well. Different tests are important at different time points. You can be asymptomatic and you can be positive. The tests that you need earlier on are the molecular tests that everyone talks about, the PCR-based tests. Later on, antibodies begin to become positive. These, however, only mean that you have been exposed to the virus. We are now moving to the stage where we have earlier tests, protein-based tests, that antigen-based tests that are moving into the realm of PCR, where people may be able to do this at home. But what you're talking about, as you can see on the diagram, is a very complex cascade of tests with no one-size-fits-all. And I think timing is everything in the testing of COVID. What happened to us? The market was flooded with tests. And although we had shortages of tests, the claims were in some instances really, really difficult. And we had to rapidly evaluate tests. Evaluations that would have taken a year before now took a week. So we had a massive test pipeline that my team and I had to work through. We had a landscape of about 600 tests of different categories. And you can see from the funnel diagram that you start with many tests and many claims, and sometimes not always appropriate claims, and you land up with what falls out at the bottom, very few good quality tests. And I think this demonstrates innovation and the difficulties one may have. The other difficulty was really the regulatory complexity. If you have a look globally, the FDA initially issued emergency use for almost everything that came along. And as we've seen with time, many have been withdrawn. There's been great confusion requiring extensive regulatory work. And if you look at that panel in the middle, if I'm confused, I can tell you most people are confused as far as what the process is. And on the last panel, you can see what we have is a hub that now looks at innovation to implementation with the same kind of funnel diagram that we have seen for COVID. What do we need to be sure? We need to be sure that the quality of our assays is maintained over time. And that's where the value of a single database has really been unique for South Africa. So we have an ability to plan, we have an ability to know where to collect specimens, but what is truly remarkable and has been developed by many members of my team is the ability to work out which test has been done where and to look at the granularity of this information at the level of the individual patient's quality. So it really is quite unique. And then as I mentioned in the beginning, information technology is absolutely essential. And what is the thing that everyone uses in South Africa? Cell phones. And so we've really led the field in digital health. And an important aspect has been to go through that value chain and make sure that we collect the specimen, that it is tracked the whole way through, and ultimately the result goes to the healthcare worker. For HIV, that took us 2 years to implement for many of the clinics. With COVID, following approval, we had 2,000 clinic sites and many more users up within a month. So it just shows you that you can work at a far more rapid rate than has been done previously. So what are we actually doing here? We're doing innovation, but it's needs-based. It's in collaboration with many partners and funders. And if I showed you the TB diagrams or the HIV diagrams, you would see they are very, very similar. And so the experience has been good. We've developed new tests, as you can see. We have clinical trials to evaluate them, specimen biorepositories. And one may think that a swab is a swab, but it certainly isn't. Different swabs have different performance. We've also disseminated knowledge. And as you can see, probably the best picture is the guy sitting on his vehicle. It's my favorite picture in the middle of the Eastern Cape, getting signal and talking to us. So what are the lessons we've learned? Is that a multidisciplinary approach is absolutely critical. We need clinicians and pathologists who are very, very undervalued, but we also need economists. We need civil society and advocacy, which have played a strong role here. And more importantly, we actually need mental health practitioners. And so it's been a series of great public-private partnerships for the first time. The difficulty has been ongoing safety, but in the beginning, the innovative safety approaches were quite remarkable, especially for lab staff. It wasn't uncommon for me to go and knock on the doors of builders' warehouse or someone else to find the right equipment. But now we need to be mindful of COVID fatigue. And the laboratories are frontline workers who are battling. What has been the unintended consequences of COVID, though? Many of our early work, as early as March or April, has showed that the gains for HIV and TB that we have made in testing has been significantly compromised during the lockdown, and TB is being more heavily impacted than HIV. So with the new tools we developed and are developing, we can now overlay our diseases, HIV, TB, and COVID. And from the diagrams, you can see that it's a moving target, but with the daily information that is collected in a central data warehouse from private and public, we're able to plot these epidemics. But what is the future epidemics that are going to really be a problem? I think TB, we've lost 10 years of gains. South Africans are actually not a well population. We have high levels of diabetes, we have high levels of hypertension, cancer, and obesity. And these are probably our next epidemics. And so the work that has been done in COVID may well assist the new epidemics that we're about to face. And so I can just close with saying that there have been many partners and funders. And if the world could just collaborate with other epidemics in the way that has been done with COVID, I think that's probably the silver lining. And so just to acknowledge all the activities and the partners that we've had to work with. Thank you.
So that was quite an insightful presentation from somebody who's working at the cold face of a pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. I also want to acknowledge her team, people that we've been working very closely with, Lindsay in particular, and Mohapi. They were fantastic to work with, weren't they?
Yes, definitely. We're sure looking forward to visiting the lab at some point when at least some things are calm. Looking forward to seeing what they come up with next. If you had asked me at the beginning of this year, what does astronomy have to do with pandemics? I would have said definitely nothing. There is nothing that links looking up at the skies from deep, deep in the middle of the Karoo. It's got nothing to do with anything in the health space. But I think I was wrong. One of the widely discussed topics in the early days of the pandemic was how many ventilators each country has. And I remember looking at an infographic put together by Reuters Graphics, which showed different countries in the north, in the south, but specifically Africa. The numbers were scary. Some countries just did not have the data, and one could then assume that maybe they don't even have functioning ventilators. But the obsession with ventilators was because that's really the tool that was needed to treat COVID patients. So we started asking ourselves, how do they work? What are they? But the least likely places that we thought we would find someone was at an organization called the South African Radio Astronomy Observatory. They do the work, they're based in the Karoo. They have offices in Cape Town and here in Johannesburg. And Professor Justin Jonas is leading a team that makes something, it creates a link. So welcome to the TEDx Johannesburg stage, Professor Justin Jonas.
Medical ventilators have been central to the narrative of COVID-19 across the world. This is a line from a recent newspaper article. You might imagine this might be an article from a South African newspaper, but it's not. It's from the New York Times. Across the world, there is this problem that there may be a shortage of ventilators, but there's a bigger shortage of personnel to use them. This is certainly the case in South Africa. USAID, the US agency, has been importing ventilators into South Africa in great numbers. The truth is these are probably being piled up in storerooms around the country because there are not the facilities and the staff to be able to use these things. There's been a lot of misinformation around the COVID crisis around the world. There's a lot of false news going around. And governments have been largely to blame for this, but also social media. Social media has provided a platform for instant virologists, and everybody in the world has suddenly become an expert in the COVID crisis, and everybody has had their opinions, and they spread them across the social media, and this has been a problem. So what you have is that the ventilators have become a villain. This is an honest newspaper headline. People who go into hospital, who go onto ventilators, a lot of them do die. But through social media, this is transformed into a sort of a different narrative, which says you get COVID, you go to hospital, they put you on a ventilator, and the ventilator kills you. And that's not true. So the other thing that social media and social platforms has brought is crowdsourcing. And crowdsourcing is great, and it can have positive and negative effects. So everybody in the world tried to build ventilators. This was something that everybody thought that they could do. They suddenly became experts, and driven by places like MIT, where students put together a ventilator based on these ambu bags. People had been watching too much television, seeing too many TV dramas, and seeing these bags being used to resuscitate patients. These bags are for emergency use only, and putting them into a mechanical device like this looks interesting, but it's actually quite dangerous. This is not what you want to do, to build ventilators like this. So looking at the COVID disease, what does it do to your lungs? In the healthy lung, you have these alveoli, which is like bunches of grapes, where oxygen comes in and gets transferred into the blood and CO2 goes out. And it's very important that there's this substance called a surfactant, which is inside these sacs, these air sacs, which stops the lungs from collapsing and sticking together. And that allows you to breathe. You also need to have a free passage of oxygen from the air into the blood. In a mild case of COVID, what starts happening is your own immune system and the virus attacks your alveoli, and you end up with a sticky substance inside the lungs rather than the surfactant, and your lungs tend to stick together. The alveoli tend to stick together, and also the transfer of oxygen is blocked. And this is what causes the respiratory distress that patients feel. So what happens when you get COVID? There's an unknown number of people who have COVID and have no symptoms. That's a number that's still not known in the world. But if you have symptoms, there's an 80% chance that you won't have to go to hospital. You will have mild symptoms, you stay at home, and that's good. There's a 20% chance that you have to go to hospital. Once you're in that 20% in the hospital, about 3/4 of the patients who go to hospital just need very simple oxygen therapy. They have very mild cases. Another big chunk of patients will need some more intensive oxygen support, and a very small number, only about 4% of the hospitalized patients will in fact have to go onto a full ventilator. So just looking at these different therapies, this is for mild infections. You go in and you can go into a normal hospital ward, or you may go into the CTICC field hospital in Cape Town, be put in a bed, and you either have a simple mask on your face or a nasal cannula. And after a few days of that therapy, you get up and go. At the other extreme, if you have a very severe case of COVID, you go onto a medical ventilator. And that requires you to be sedated, immobilized, and it requires very, very specialized services. You need to be in an ICU, and you need to have ICU doctors and ICU nurses. Very expensive and a very scarce resource. But there's this interesting group of mild infections where you don't need a full ventilator, but a simple oxygen mask is not good enough for you. And there are two main modalities there for treating patients. One is the thing called HFNO, high flow nasal oxygen, and the other one is CPAP. And we're going to be talking here about the CPAP process. This is what was decided to be the most relevant modality for treating patients in this area. So what the National Ventilator Project has done has run a process to have locally developed ventilators, simple ventilators, these CPAP ventilators, continuous positive airway pressure ventilators. And what these things do, they're very simple devices, and they are very intrinsically safe. They are simple to use. They use a simple mask, and they are very effective in treating the patients. So I have here an example of one of the devices that we have produced. You can see a simple mask goes onto the patient's face, and instead of a fancy ventilator, what we have instead is this very, very simple device which plugs in to a standard the hospital oxygen supply. This will plug into the wall or perhaps into an oxygen tank. So this was the modality that was decided that the National Ventilator Project would pursue. It was fairly simple and also very effective. I've put only needs oxygen in italics in the slide, because this is a bigger issue. You do still need oxygen. COVID patients do need oxygen. So the National Ventilator Project, what is it, and what is SORAO, the organization that I actually work for? National Ventilator Project comes out of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, and the idea was to produce locally produced South African ventilators which would aid in the treatment of COVID in South Africa. What is SORAO? SORAO is the South African Radio Astronomy Observatory. We build radio telescopes. How is this possibly related to providing ventilators to combat COVID? And the truth is that there's actually quite a lot of similarity between what we did to build radio telescopes and what is required to produce ventilators in South Africa. And so SORAO took on the job of basically project management of the National Ventilator Project, provided engineering services, and all the way through to the manufacture and deployment of these devices. So when we got going, we had to go into a whole lot of product development. We did this in collaboration with local industry. We had 90-something industries who actually put up their hand to say, we would like to help you. That was far too big a number for us to practically work with. We whittled that down to a smaller number. And interestingly, around the world, where this sort of work was happening, motor car industries were playing a big role. Particularly Mercedes Formula One in the UK came up with this so-called Ventura device, which we investigated ourselves. We also looked into different ways of providing the oxygen to the patients, not just a mask, but also having a full face mask or a hood. And the whole advantage of a hood is that it actually would contain any exhalant from the patient, so basically stop the virus from spreading. We went through a whole process of prototyping and testing the prototypes, qualifying them, and then finally into production. And this, of course, is where industry came into play, doing the actual manufacture. We were very involved in the quality assurance. These are medical devices. You have to have good quality assurance. And then you build these things. You need to have workers who are going to put these things together in assembly and testing. And then eventually, of course, putting these things in boxes and distributing them to the hospitals. And so that was the end-to-end process that we as Soreo ran. So there were many challenges that we had to face in producing these ventilators. And one of the biggest ones was what I call noise in the system. A lot of people, very opinionated people, trying to say, this is what you need to do. And we couldn't listen to everybody. We had to listen to only a few voices that we selected as being good voices. And we did that, and it was very similar to the process that we had to do when we built the Meerkat radio telescope. We had thousands of scientists across the world trying to tell us what to do. We had to select the voices that we wanted to hear so we actually could build something. So that was something we already had experience of. And then the other one was we had to produce 20,000 devices in a very, very short space of time. And of course, that was a challenge, but with good project management and contract management that we had in Soreo, we managed to do that, I think, okay. There are other challenges in the context that we worked in, and there were no medical manufacturing companies in South Africa, but that was mitigated very easily because of the enthusiasm of local industry to get involved. And the banner shown here, I think, really just shows the spirit of these industries, and these were car manufacturing industries that we were working with. Of course, the big challenges was things that were happening in the public sector. Across South Africa, there was very disparate state of readiness and capability in the hospitals. These devices had to be deployed into the hospitals. We had to make sure that these devices could be used in any kind of hospital in South Africa. One of the big ones was there was a state of disaster, but there was not really a feeling in many government departments of the fact that there was an emergency, that you actually had to do something slightly different from the way that you would normally have done it, because this is now, there was an emergency on the go. And of course, silos within the government, not helped by in South Africa, where we have national and provincial government agencies, and particularly in the Department of Health. And this caused us a lot of stress. But out of all of this and out of all these challenges, we got a lot of lessons from COVID. And I think there are also dividends that can come out of this. One of the clear things is we know that our infrastructures are broken in the country, particularly in the hospitals. This has really been shown up. And the oxygen supply has been a big issue. COVID patients need oxygen. Even here at Charlotte Mekeke Hospital down the road, where one of the biggest hospitals in the country, best equipped hospitals in the country, it took us 2 weeks to get the oxygen supply sorted out. And this is really was even worse in the rural areas. There were processes happening in the country, and again, funded by USAID, by US funders, to look into oxygen supply in hospitals. And this was a very successful process. This process must not stop. This must now continue into the future to make sure that our hospitals do have good oxygen supplies. The other thing we learned, I think, is that you don't need the fancy ventilators to treat COVID patients. You can get by with these MVP devices. The MVP device costs on the order of $80. A full function ventilator costs $25,000. So you can see that these devices would be able to serve a large number of patients. Also, they're very simple to use, and so you don't need the highly skilled doctors and ICU staff to use them. In fact, the patient themselves could almost apply this therapy to themselves. And so we're putting forward a proposal to the Department of Health that these devices should have a life after COVID to treat other respiratory diseases, which we know we have in South Africa. One of the things that all countries have learned is that they have to become independent suppliers themselves of medical devices. When it comes to these sorts of crises, there's a big crunch across the world, and so you have to have your own capacity to build and deploy things like ventilators and other medical devices. So that's one of the things that we've now started up within the National Ventilator Project is
alert from system UI server, low battery.
But there needs to be some government support into this. You need incubation. You need to have some funding and make it easy for companies to make this transition into building medical devices. Allow them to license these devices for medical use. Have a proactive licensing rather than a reactive licensing regime, which we have at the moment. and then make sure that these devices get deployed into the hospitals and they are used by patients and doctors, or used on patients by doctors in the system.
So that's a wonderful, piece of African innovation right there. Look forward to hearing more from Professor Justin Jonas. Kabelo has stepped aside. She'll join us again later on in the second session. I'm now with my friend and co-curator of TEDxJohannesburg, Rosh Mamabolo.
Thank you for having me. Quite an amazing conference so far. I mean, we have spoken about ventilators, testing. We've spoken about quite a number of things COVID related. One of the things that COVID has done is, has subjected us to social distancing and lockdowns. And one of the things that we actually have managed through this difficult period is music. Music has really kept us emotionally in control. The next speaker is a musician, a violinist who started playing violin at the age of 10. And today he's an experienced artist with local and international experience in jazz, orchestra, and other genres. Let's welcome on stage, on the TEDxJohannesburg stage, Kabelo Motlhomi.
Hi, my name is Kabelo Motlhomi, violinist from Johannesburg. I'm going to play you two pieces from South Africa, one called The Wedding. This is a song that helped me through very difficult times in my life when I had a small depression in a cold country in England studying music. And yeah, I woke up to this song every day.
That was a beautiful performance.
Amazing, quite vivid. Yeah, you can imagine the power of music during these difficult times, you know, keeps us very influenza, smallpox, HIV and AIDS. I mean, these are some of the worst pandemics that we get to know of. But very little do we know of hepatitis pandemic. To tell us more about this disease and its effects, all the way from Nigeria, is Danjuma Adda. Danjuma is a prince and is a public health expert. Let's welcome on the TEDxJohannesburg stage, Danjuma.
The outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is a viral infection, SARS-CoV-2, took the entire global community by storm, affected so many economies. So many lives have been lost and are still being lost. In fact, the entire global community is grappling to survive this pandemic. So in the midst of all of this, the attention of the scientific and medical community was drawn to this announcement by the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine when they announced a serious breakthrough of the identification of another viral infection. This viral infection affects several millions of people all over the world. In fact, kills several thousands of people. In Africa alone, kills over 200,000. In Africa alone, over 60 million affected with a combination of these two viruses. And it also took my mother in 2007. This killer disease takes more than 1.34 million lives annually. The other silent killer is called viral hepatitis. The Nobel Prize recognized a true breakthrough. It honored 3 researchers for the discovery of the hepatitis C virus. So the work by these 3 awardees paved the way for highly accurate and effective blood tests for the hepatitis C virus. In 1976, a similar award was given to Baruch Blumberg for discovering the hepatitis B virus, another silent killer. Hepatitis, from the Greek names, simply refers to liver and inflammation. Chronic hepatitis leads to liver damage, which may progress to cirrhosis and liver cancer. Viral infection is the leading cause of hepatitis. What organ in the body does these viruses affect? Your guess is as good as mine. It affects the liver. So to better understand this, can we take a journey to understand the liver? Your liver and my liver is one of our body's most important organs. It cleans toxins from your body and helps you digest food and absorb nutrients. The liver is the largest organ inside the body. In an adult, it is about the size of a football and weighs close to 3 pounds. It is located behind the ribs in the upper right-hand portion of the abdomen. Shaped like a triangle, the liver is dark reddish brown and consists of 2 main lobes. There are over 300 billion specialized cells in the liver that are connected by well-organized systems of bile ducts and blood vessels called the biliary system. The liver is such an important organ that we can only survive 2 or 3 days if it shuts down. If the liver fails, your body will fail too. What then does this liver do? If your body was to be considered an automobile, your liver will be considered as the engine. Oh yes, that's how important it is. It does hundreds of vital things to make sure everything runs smoothly. Some of the most important functions of the liver include it stores vitamins, sugar, and iron to help give our body energy. It controls the production and removal of cholesterol. It clears our body of waste products, drugs, and other poisonous substances. The liver helps to make clotting factors to stop excessive bleeding after cuts or injuries. The liver also makes immune factors and removes bacteria from the blood to fight infection. The liver releases a substance called bile, which helps the body to digest food and absorb nutrients. Imagine an automobile with a faulty engine, and that is a human being with a liver that is damaged. Imagine an automobile with an engine that has knocked down. It cannot move. That automobile can go nowhere. The same way, that body will go nowhere. Now, the medical term hepatitis means inflammation of the liver. Chronic inflammation of the liver may result in liver damage or failure if left untreated. But then, this hepatitis can be caused by many different things. Drinking too much alcohol, trauma or injury, autoimmune disorders, an adverse reaction to drugs, herbal treatments or supplements, or viruses such as what we're talking about today, viral hepatitis A, B, C, D, and E. Now, how can hepatitis virus damage or affect the liver? A healthy liver is soft, flexible, but with chronic hepatitis infection, the liver comes under attack by the virus and it then becomes hardened over time. Now, what disease condition does this virus causes in the liver? It causes the first stage, which is called fibrosis. After becoming inflamed, the liver now tries to repair itself by forming tiny scars. When the scarring continues, it makes it difficult for the liver to do its job. As the damage continues, as the scarring continues, many scars now come together, they join and they form the next stage of the disease condition, which is called liver cirrhosis. With a chronic hepatitis infection, large areas of the liver can then become permanently scarred and nodules may form. Blood can no longer flow freely through because of the scarred liver tissues. This then causes the liver to begin to shrink and become hard. It now leads to this particular stage called the liver cancer. If cirrhosis becomes very severe, liver failure can then occur. This means the liver is unable to filter waste, is unable to remove toxins, and unable to remove drugs. It can no longer produce the clotting profile necessary to stop bleeding. Liver failure can lead to death. Then the last stage of the disease condition caused by viral hepatitis is called liver cancer. In fact, viral hepatitis B and C are the leading cause of liver cancer. Now, one explanation for this is that damage to liver cells may alter the genes inside the cells in such a way that they can become cancerous. People living with chronic hepatitis B infections are at a higher risk of developing liver cancer, and that is why they must be tested. Early detection saves lives. Combined together, viral hepatitis B and C causes the death of over 1.34 million lives annually. In Africa alone, over 200,000 lives die every year. In fact, about 4 people die every second. It also cost the life of my mom. We never knew it until it was too late. Her liver was damaged already. It had developed liver cancer. Recognizing the importance of this silent killer, the WHO set a viral hepatitis elimination goal by 2030, whereby about 194 member countries signed up to the elimination target and goals, including your country. Already, because of what these 3 researchers have done, there are new blood tests and drugs for these deadly diseases, and it has saved so many millions of lives. But for many of us in most countries, the celebration of this breakthrough is bittersweet. For some of us, the revolution in diagnosis and treatment remains a distant dream. Over 325 million people that are living with hepatitis globally, like the population of the United States of America. Yet, 95% of those who have viral hepatitis don't even know it. And in most countries, including my own, the vast majority of those who are sick are not getting diagnosed. For those who even come to the hospital, they are misdiagnosed by some health workers. And for some people, they are treated when it is too late. Why is this so? Probably because of low awareness among the general public, even among healthcare providers. It characterizes a silent killer in the world. In most of our communities in Africa, cultural practices such as scarification, circumcision, uvulectomy, tribal marks, and weak healthcare systems such as poor screening of blood for transfusion, unprotected sexual intercourse with infected people, or even transmission of mother to baby, are the drivers of these silent killers in our communities. In most of Africa, majority of the over 60 million patients that are living with hepatitis cannot even afford the cost of diagnosis and treatment. Only very few countries have health insurance that provides testing and treatment, while majority of people spend out of pocket for diagnosis and treatment. Due to the silent nature of its effect on the liver, majority of people living with this disease are unaware of the damaging effects of it has on the liver until it is too late. One of these was my mother. None of us knew that she had it. Even though we took her to the hospital several times, over and over again, each time her eyes turned yellow. The doctors would dismiss it, and they prescribe painkillers and give her treatments for either malaria or typhoid and ask us to go. 15 years after the symptoms started, she was diagnosed with end-stage liver cancer caused by hepatitis. It was too late to save her. It doesn't have to be this way. Like hepatitis C, hepatitis B can be detected even in people who exhibit no symptoms. Hepatitis B infection is preventable with vaccinations and treatable if caught early. People living with hepatitis should not be left to their own fates. We have the means to stop this silent killer. We can test those at risk, provide vaccinations at birth, and make hepatitis drugs available and affordable. The global response to HIV and now COVID-19 has shown us what can be achieved when government, civil society, international organizations, and private sector work together with a common goal. In fact, unlocking the mystery of hepatitis C was a towering achievement. But the next essential step is to ensure that this discovery reaches its potential to alleviate the suffering and save the lives of millions of people in countries, including mine. It is my hope that while we survive the COVID-19 pandemic, all efforts should be put in place to accelerate the WHO goals of eliminating viral hepatitis by 2030.
Yeah, and I'd like to commend and salute Danjuma for finding a way of telling the story in such a way that I think, people who might be ignorant of hepatitis, viral hepatitis, might actually begin to care about it. So congratulations, my friend. I hope that we can reach the target that you are describing, zero hepatitis by 2030.
Quite an amazing talk. I think one of the things is, as we are battling with COVID pandemic, let's not lose sight of other silent pandemics that are taking place. One of the innovations that has been brought by the COVID-19 pandemics is things like sanitizing, social distancing, lockdowns, and masks. And now we are being forced as a result of the situation to wear masks, not only just once in a while, but almost every day. When you step out, you need to wear a mask. The next speaker has got a special skill of turning mundane things, ordinary things, into special things. Looking forward to this talk by Stacey Rosen. Let's welcome her on stage.
So pre-pandemic, the mask was a movie. There were masquerades. The African mask was used for rituals. And the N95, it was a highway. Then COVID-19 arrived, and our lives were literally ripped at the seams. There was an infodemic, facts and stats, data and details. News headlines bombarded us. There was no escaping the media overload. This caused panic and fear, anxiety, unease about the disease. This was the new normal, the trending hashtag, the lockdown lingo. Stay home, stay safe, wear masks. PPE became a buzzword. The mask emoji became predictive text. And yet, despite all the pleas, there was resistance to wearing masks. So in the midst of the pandemic, a group of volunteers created a nonprofit called 10 Million Masks in service of our community. There was a call to sew. It spread via text messages from one sewer to another. Sow hope, sow love, sow masks. A guide for makers was created. Autonomous sewing circles formed organically. Seamstresses in their homes during lockdown made cloth masks. They were able to reach their neighbors in their own communities. The reach extended across South Africa to Botswana, Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Kenya, and then to Australia and New Zealand. Here's the thing. The yarn threading my story together began pre-lockdown. When everybody else was stocking up on toilet paper, I was stocking up on wool and cotton. Because as a craftivist, crucial to me surviving a pandemic is a well-stocked yarn stash. And chocolate, of course. Forget the toilet paper. You see, I have a love for yarns. It's contagious. The yarn of thread, the yarn of story, and how the two intertwine, ravel and unravel, weave together in the stitching of our lives. Craftivism uses handicrafts such as crochet, knit, and embroidery to tell impactful stories. Craftivists rise for causes close to their hearts, and so I rose for a cause close to mine, and the revolution began. My design plays with the word love submerged within the word revolution. Revolutionary love can spread virally, healing humanity during difficult times. And then 10 Million Masks invited me to curate a group of embroiderers in the creation of art masks. We formed a quarantine, socially connected online, physically apart offline in lockdown. As curator, I welcomed a mixology of voices and stitching styles. I didn't direct their designs or creativity. I gently held space for kindred spirits. Coordinating a collab during lockdown was challenging. The group never gathered in a craft circle. Communication was via text messages only. We didn't Zoom because data was expensive. Despite it all, each stitch was made with loving kindness. All the craftivists shared their personal stories embodied in their art masks. Words were used as visual imagery, symbols as meaningful messages. 10 Million Masks shared our collection online, reaching many worldwide. I was wowed by each art mask, so unique, so touching, so heartfelt. Our quarantine had made heartfelt stories that touched many. When the going gets tough, slow down. Slow stitching with its repetitive flows and rhythms, it calms us. Mindfulness practice offers us gentle compassion, being here, now, stitch by stitch. This is soul work as a labor of love. Stories help us find meaning in the living of life, especially during unprecedented times such as these. They connect us all, the maker, the wearer, and the viewer of the mask. A mask is not just a piece of cloth to slow the contagion. It is a meaningful messenger and an artwork. Handicrafts are not just a hobby. Each stitch is an important mark we make on the world. Yarns share life lessons. We have all endured so much this year. Masks muted us. Now they have become communicators and healers simultaneously. Craftivism is important during pandemics for mental, physical, and spiritual well-being. The artistry of craft and the craftistry of art co-create. A simple revolutionary idea made mask wearing more acceptable. So thread love into the world, mend Africa and our torn humanity. Discard perfection in favor of heartistry so that we don't just survive a pandemic, but thrive beyond it. Remember to smize. Become a revolutionist. And most importantly, tell stories that resonate, because my yarn is the teller of me. Your yarn is the teller of you. And together, our yarns are the tellers of us. Thank you.
Yeah. Remember to smile.
Yeah, and that's what happens when you combine the power of design with a high level of consciousness.
Yeah. Yeah. Suddenly you see masks with a different eye. Interesting.
Yeah, Stacey, Rosen, thank you very much for the beautiful heart, sister. Yeah. So up next, again from the media world, two wonderful souls, Laura Grant and Alistair Otter. They are from Media Hack, and the many different visualizations that we got used to in the South African landscape many of them originated from their studio, from their office. So we look forward to their talk. It is a bit longer than usual, but that's because we needed to cover quite a bit of ground with them. They did have many very important things that we needed them to share. So without further ado, in just a moment,
Laura and Alice,
I'm still asking for the moments.
Yeah. So far, great content, amazing talks. We are looking forward to your inputs. Please don't shy away from posting on the chat your views. If there's any questions, we'll try and cover those at the end. And also, on social media, hashtag and just tweet your experience of the conference.
Yeah. Conference. Yeah.
Why do people turn to data in a pandemic? I mean, for every day for the past year, the National Department of Health has been releasing an infographic that gives us information about how many people have been infected, how many people have passed away, and how many new cases we have every day. And people have shared this on social media. They've talked about it on WhatsApp. The latest infographic from Friday, the 27th of November, shows us that South Africa has 781,000 people who've tested positive for the virus, and we've lost just over 21,000 people to the virus. And from the day before, our daily increase is just over 3,000 cases. And also, this graphic can show you that Gauteng has the most cases and the most fatalities. But imagine if that was the only data that you got. If these were the numbers in this graphic was the only information that you could get. For example, it doesn't tell you whether South Africa is getting better or worse in terms of the outbreak numbers. It doesn't tell you how we compare with other countries. And it doesn't tell us where the hotspots are in South Africa. I don't remember a time outside of an election when people have been this interested in numbers. They even go searching online for them, looking for more. Why? Because these numbers tell the story. They tell a story of what's happening in South Africa with the COVID-19 pandemic. And this story helps people to make sense of what's going on. How do we know this? Well, because we built a dashboard, Alistair and I, in March, using the official numbers that are released by the National Department of Health. And since, in the 9 months since that dashboard was released, we've had more than 800,000 people coming to visit us. A lot of those people visit us more than once a day, or at least every day, sorry. And they sent us, they've got in contact with us. So they've sent us emails, they've made suggestions, they've asked us questions, and a lot of that interaction with people, a lot of that feedback has fed into what our dashboard looks like now. We've built a community around this dashboard, and we can we can see what the data's told us by watching what's happened over the course of the last 9 months. I just want to show you a slide. Right at the beginning of the pandemic, most of the people who were infected had been traveling from other countries, mostly from Europe. We made a map showing what the National Institute of Communicable Disease showed us, where they came from. But by the 15th of March, the first local transmissions had started. And that was when the president declared a state of disaster. And most of the people were confined to their homes. So the data not only told us what was happening at the time, then the daily cases were about 110 a day. But the data also helped us set milestones. If you look at this graph, you can see that the number one, that line where number one is where the first lockdown level, the hard lockdown started. And you can see it was very, very early on in our pandemic. We had no idea what was to come. Even though this lockdown was very early on, at the time we had no idea what to expect. So what was useful about the data as well is it helped us set milestones so that we could see where we were going. And one of them that I think is a good example was Prof. Salim Abdul Karim, who is the chair of the Ministerial Advisory Committee, gave us a target during during a televised broadcast where he said, if on the week of the 6th to 13th of April, the average number of daily cases stayed below 44%, we would ease the lockdown. So we started to track this on our dashboard, and unfortunately, the average cases were 96, and that meant that the lockdown was going to be extended. So we were able to show people, things were not as good as the scientists wanted by putting it on the dashboard and letting people see how we were doing. So looking back now, you can see that lockdown, the first lockdown, the hard lockdown, was imposed very, very early on in the pandemic. And if you look at where our peak happened, which was in mid-July, I think you can safely say that lockdown actually did do what I think it was intended to do, which was to prepare us, was to slow down the wave of infections and prepare our healthcare system for what was to come. And that was in mid-July. By that time, there were 12,000 on average cases a day. And it lasted for probably about 2 weeks where it was really bad. And then it started to drop off in August. In September, October, we've had it relatively easy. It's been 1,500 cases a day. At the peak of our infection, we were one of the top 5 countries in the worst hit countries in the world. Now we're down to, I think it's 16. In terms of daily cases, it's 36. But I think that what's clear from this chart is that we actually can't just assume that the worst is over. We weathered the storm. I think that this chart shows us that our healthcare system weathered the storm. We lost over 21,000 people, and many, many people, because of lockdowns, have lost their jobs. But it could possibly have been worse if we didn't take the precautions that we did earlier. I think what is interesting to look at is the way that the numbers are starting to rise again at the moment. The data is showing us that we have to be careful. I want to finish off with a chart just to show that even though the national numbers look like they're rising, it's important to look down at provincial and district level data. In South Africa, this is where our problem lies. The district level data is not released by the National Department of Health. It is released by the individual provincial governments in 9 different ways. They all have their own way of doing it. And it's released generally as infographics and on social media and very intermittently. So you can't follow what's going on. If you look at this chart of the provinces, at the moment, the increase is actually focusing really on the Eastern Cape and a little bit in the Western Cape. But if you had to really dig into the district data, if it was really available, you would see that actually the hotspot in the Eastern Cape is Nelson Mandela Bay. If we were able to have access to that information, it would, I think, we would be able to chart it, and it would show people where the risks are. I think that the difference in the accessibility of this data, the district and the national data, shows something very important. Good data instills confidence. It gives people a sense that the authorities have the measure of the problem. It gives people a sense that we're in control of this pandemic. And that's why making this data publicly available is important. I'm going to hand over to Alistair, who can carry on with the importance of publicly available data.
Of course. So throughout this process, we've learned a number of lessons, important lessons, I think, and things that I think that we need to bear in mind in possibly future pandemics. Unfortunately, we probably will face those. But as Laura says, having accessible data and reliable data, which is available to the public, tends in general to instill trust in the authorities and in that data. The problem that we had prior to people like ourselves doing dashboards is that, as Laura pointed out, is that each day a single number was given out. So many people had died, there's so many cases, but there was no context in that. And in the absence of that kind of context, people tend to start imagining what is actually happening. And we saw this very early on. There was this initial little spike, which in retrospect was a very small spike, but at the time people were seeing these big numbers and were imagining that this was significantly worse than it really was at that point. Fortunately, that was only a very small blip at the beginning of the lockdown. So in the absence of reliable data, people tend to kind of imagine things or come up with their own conspiracy theories about what's true and what's not. And we saw a lot of this during the early stages of the pandemic, where people started to almost distrust the authorities because they, you know, it was one day the number was this, the next day it was this, and it was significantly different, and there was no sense of progression or any kind of a context that allowed them to see that this was going up or down, or, as Laura says, that it was affecting certain regions over other regions. I think the problem in that is that the lessons that we probably need to learn out of this is that we can't manage something like a pandemic through a kind of process of fear. So saying, if you go outside, you're probably going to get sick. At worst, you may even die. You can't manage that effectively because at some point that gets overstated and people start to distrust that, or they have experiences which differ to what you're trying, the message that, in this case, government would be trying to put out. Rather, we need to be managing pandemics and issues like this by utilizing what is essentially public data to inform people so that they can make their own decisions. And I think our experience with the dashboard is that was the biggest thing for most people was, what is the context? How is this changing? Is it going up? Isn't it going up? Are these numbers reliable? By making data publicly available, I'd like to call it almost like peer review. Although it's not peer, it's giving it to people so that people can actually interrogate that data. And we saw this repeatedly throughout this process of coronavirus. Data would go out, we would publish it, and we'd have people responding to us going, why is this like this? Why is this number changed so radically? Why does this look incorrect? And that's an empowering thing because it actually gives people the opportunity to interrogate the kind of information that's been put out by public officials and make their own decisions about it, and perhaps even feed back into a process where now we are able to say, and in many cases we went to certain provincial departments and said, like, why does this not look right? What is missing in this data? Currently, there's a good case in point. Gauteng provincial government has stopped releasing active cases and recoveries. The recoveries and hence the active cases, they've stopped releasing it. Even before that was announced by the national department just a few days ago, we had people contacting us going, why do these numbers in Gauteng look wrong? What's going on here? Something's not right. I'm not suggesting that we necessarily had caused an investigation into that, but certainly people were already picking up on it before the provincial government had actually ordered the Gauteng provincial government, national, had ordered the provincial government to actually interrogate that. So it's a very empowering thing, and it allows people to build, to understand the data and the context that they live in. I think in general, South Africans reacted very well to the pandemic. I think people did the best in most cases to actually limit their contacts to work with it. Clearly not everyone, but in most cases do. But I do think that, and we certainly weren't the only people trying to publicize this data, but I think the more data out there, the more people were empowered to make those decisions. Because at the end of the day, this is public data, and it is their lives and their families' lives that are at risk. And we need to understand that. But I mean, I think at the end of the day, the one big lesson for us in many ways is that and this is probably a little bit harsh, but a lot of the media didn't actually address the core questions that a lot of people had. People wanted to know very specific information about where they lived, how it was affecting them, and having simply reporting on the national level on a daily basis, saying nationally, as Laura says, certain regions stand out as hotspots in this thing. Having the data being released at a national level, just with a single figure that encapsulated the pandemic in South Africa, was largely insufficient in many cases. In the early stages of the pandemic, for example, the Western Cape was seen as the one major hotspot. The reality is it wasn't the Western Cape as a whole, it was Cape Town, or portions of Cape Town, that were significantly hit. Currently, we're seeing, as Laura said, the Eastern Cape is a hotspot that's picking up again. Again, it's not the whole of the Eastern Cape, it's Nelson Mandela Bay. So that level of information, it needs to be more granular than just a single digit or a single number to cover an entire country. That was insufficient. And I think the lesson in that for us, particularly as we do come from a journalism background, was we need to be doing a better job of answering people's questions. Our readers and the people that look to us for information want specific kinds of information. They don't want regurgitated things that they can get anywhere else. They actually want actual answers that affect their lives. So there were a number of lessons within this entire process, but certainly the need for information to combat a pandemic was the first and foremost one. The other one was that people are drawn to data if it's presented in a certain way that helps them understand what's happening in the world around them. That was very important. And also that there's a community of people that want to engage with this data and want to actually feed back or have some input on that or ask questions and actually push it forward. So there were a number of elements in that, but at the end of the day, these are charts, and these charts are bars and they're lines, but they actually represent people, and they represent people's lives, and they actually represent the impact of the pandemic on a country like South Africa or anywhere else in the world. And at the end of the day, we need to remember that. So we do the charts as a way to try and explain how this affects people in a very real manner. I think that's pretty much kind of the work that we've been doing. It's been both rewarding and enlightening. And certainly, I hope we don't have to do this for much longer, but we continue to do it. I'd like to see the end of the pandemic. I'm sure we all would. But until we can get a handle on the current kind of increase, it looks like we could be doing this for a little while longer.
Yeah.
So I think that's us.
Thank you.
So wonderful insights into the numbers. They tell a story, and behind that story are human beings. Yeah, and I think that's important. This talk was longer than most others will be today and have been, but it's important to tell the full story. There are lives at stake, there are livelihoods at stake, and for that we made an exception. So thank you very much, Laura and Alistair. We are now done with the first session. We had an amazing lineup in the first session. Mia, Shaneel, Professor Wendy, we spoke about ventilators, we spoke about labs, played some music. Now we are getting into the next phase of this conference, but before we do that, we are going to get into Q&A. Yeah, so if there's any questions, comments, please fire away on the chats. Yeah. And yeah. So I'm going to ask the panelists, who are some of the speakers who you would have seen earlier on. I think it's Shaneel Bachoo, Danjuma Adda, and Stacey Rosen, just to unmute their videos, please. There we go.
Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you. Okay. That was a wonderful talk, Stacey. Thank you very much for the great work that you do.
Thanks, Tati. It's been an amazing experience. I really enjoyed everything from the beginning to now. Yeah. Thanks
Stacey,
a lot.
If you can just turn your camera so that we can see more of you, that would be great.
Just a second.
Yeah, that looks better already. Stacey,
So I'm going to ask you one question, just coming out of your work and the idea that you shared with us. I'm going to ask you also to just keep your answer brief. We have kind of gone past the time that we were hoping to be at by now. But here's the question. How does the online platform thread craftivists into the world during a pandemic, especially in the African context? You understand my question?
So, yeah, I got it. So craftivism is reliant on social media to disseminate our stories. With the art masks, our stitched stories have to go viral in order to spread the message. In the African context, though, that's a challenge, as we don't all have easy access to Wi-Fi and data is expensive. A lot of the story sharing occurred via smartphones, via WhatsApp, via text messaging, from one person to another, and that included the call to sew, the sharing of patterns, the figuring out of logistics, especially in lockdown. So in comparison with the wonderful craftivists overseas in the USA, the UK, Europe, and Australia, there's a very contrasting thing happening. For example, the COVID-19 quilt, which originated in Australia, was able to spread worldwide through Instagram throughout the pandemic. It reached globally because people had access to Wi-Fi and to data. In contrast, although our mask stories resonate globally, it has been important just even to reach our African communities. And it's therefore vital in Africa that we get cheaper data, wider access to free Wi-Fi for all storytelling to occur.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. And especially in this particular climate that we live in, right? Where we aren't able to meet in person. So thank you so much. Yes. Our next, I think we'd like to ask, I think it's Danjuma. Thank you, Stacey. We'll see you later. Danjuma. Ah, there we go. Danjuma is coming to us all the way from Nigeria, Taraba State in Nigeria. Is that, so you're in Jalingo?
Yes, I am in Jalingo.
Yeah.
It's northeastern part of Nigeria.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
How is the grid situation working out?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
How is the grid situation in Nigeria working? We've been reading a lot in the media about how the grid has collapsed.
Okay, did you talk about breach or what is it collapse? I'm not sure I'm following that really.
Okay, don't worry. Let's move on to the question that I really want to ask today. So in your talk, you mentioned that the global goal of zero hepatitis by 2030 is your current focus right now. But what do countries and partners need to do to fast track the attainment of this goal?
All right, thank you, Teddy, and thank you, TEDxJohannesburg, for this great opportunity. Now, there are about 3 or 5 pillars that the Global Health Sector Strategy identifies that countries need to look at, and that will fast track the acceleration goal of hepatitis elimination. Basically, most African countries are lagging behind, especially in health financing, domestic financing in particular, and then domesticating either the production of the drugs, treatment, diagnostics. For example, the professor that just shared the wonderful diagnostics, the wonderful face masks in Johannesburg, South Africa. That is what we want to see. We want to see local pharmaceutical industries, governments giving the political will for local production of drugs. This has happened in Rwanda, where these hepatitis C drugs, and even in Egypt, is produced locally. So that also opens up the economy and then reduce cost of importation. Because as it is now, Teddy, the COVID-19 has disrupted supply chain for hepatitis drugs because all our drugs are imported from Asia. And with the breakdown in shipments, I believe me, we have serious problems, for example, in Nigeria, at the point we're almost stock out of hepatitis drugs because there were no shipments coming in. So countries could facilitate or fast track this by increasing domestic financing. It's high time we look away from funding and foreign partnership. I'm glad to see the example, even countries like South Africa are taking the lead, even, for example, the HIV response. Domestic financing is critical. That is what is like in Africa. If you look at the target towards attaining this goal, Africa is so lagging behind. Not more than 3 countries in Africa have domesticated shown serious political and financial commitment towards eradicating hepatitis. For example, this can be done, hepatitis B can be prevented through birth dose vaccine, but not up to 45, not up to 20 countries in Africa have moved up to 50% in providing birth dose vaccine for babies at birth. Pregnant women are not being tested. So harm reduction, hepatitis C elimination can be integrated into harm reduction. So a lot of opportunities were missing. The birth dose vaccine is one area African nations and continents all over, countries all over the world can stop hepatitis B through by saving unborn generations. We can close the tap to new infections by just immunizing all babies born at birth with the hepatitis B vaccine, immunizing healthcare workers, immunizing populations at risk. So, but that's just what we need in Africa to increase the political and financial commitment.
Yeah, and let's hope the decision makers are listening, and they will listen even some more now that we've had this COVID-19 experience. Thank you very much, and good luck, my friend, and thank you for a wonderful talk.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so next, I'd like to welcome Shaneel Bachoo. Are you there, Shaneel?
I am here, Tati.
Can you switch on your video, please?
There we go.
Yeah, fantastic. Shaneel, again, also you, my brother, thank you so much for a crisp and clear talk. You made a really good case for the SPI and versus the status quo. Here's the question, though. There's an interesting scenario that plays itself out. Costa Rica, a relatively poor country, scores very well on the SPI, right? We know that, but not so well on GDP. The UAE, or United Arab Emirates, on the other hand, is the opposite. The country is high on GDP, excuse the pun, and low on SPI. What can you tell us about the relationship between GDP and SPI?
I think those are two excellent examples that you've chosen there, Tati, to make this point. There is a relationship between GDP and social progress, in that as countries become wealthier in GDP per capita, we can expect that social outcomes start to improve. But the challenge with that is that there's two reasons why we would still want to deliberately measure social progress and not use GDP as a proxy indicator. The first, of course, is that GDP is an economic metric, and it should be used as an economic metric and not as an indicator for social progress. But the second one, and this touches on what you were saying just now, is that as countries become wealthier, they start to achieve different and in some ways disproportionate levels of social progress. So some countries are better at turning increases in GDP into better social outcomes for the nation versus other countries, and I think that's a crucial point. So the point is that ultimately we want to advance social progress. Measuring GDP is more of an input factor in some ways, and so because of the different ways in which countries are able to transform GDP into social outcomes, it's important to measure social progress. I mean, Costa Rica example that you made, I think they have a level of wealth measured in GDP per capita that is about half that of the UK and some of the European countries, but they have a level of social progress that is quite similar to some of the European countries. So, they have been particularly good at converting the wealth that they've gained into better social outcomes for the people of Costa Rica. So I think that's a great example, and I think that speaks to the reason for why yes, GDP is important and we need to monitor it, but at the same time we also need to look at social outcomes in an objective and accurate way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I do hope that the SPI as a measurement tool becomes more prevalent, in the years, in the months, in the period that comes. We certainly do need alternatives to GDP. Okay, thank you very much, Shaneel. Thank you again for a wonderful talk.
My pleasure.
We go on with the program.
Yes, I'm back. We ran a bit over time, the first session. We are just going to continue and keep the questions coming. What we are not able to cover today, we will definitely cover in future webinars, salons, and hopefully through social media. Our next speaker is a technologist. He's been at this, I think, for quite a long time. And I was thinking of him a few months ago when Netflix released a documentary titled The Social Dilemma, because from the conversations online, at least, that came out of that documentary, there was a heated debate, the role of social media in society. And like Stacey said, social media is key now during a pandemic, but also the access to data and different platforms on the African continent are heavily dependent on some of these tools that have become, in one way, our savior, in another way, our worst nightmare. So in looking at the role of social media during the pandemic, we reached out to Gustav Praekelt, who is the chairperson, founder of the Praekelt Group. And they've been working a lot with some of these tools in the health space. And we wanted to find out what they have been up to during the pandemic. Welcome to the TEDx Johannesburg stage, Gustav Praekelt.
In the era of COVID-19, misinformation can spread faster than the virus itself. What science knows about it can change from one day to the next. This is why it's so important to have real-time, safe and secure mechanism to provide information during a pandemic. But communication has changed, and the way we communicate to our citizens has changed. What used to be straightforward and centralized through newspapers, radio and television now is decentralized and less easy to communicate. There are now over 5 billion people with mobile devices, social networks, and in the absence of correct information, misinformation and memes can spread virally almost faster than the virus itself. This is why we built Health Alert together with the Department of Health in South Africa to combat misinformation and to provide secure and accurate information to every citizen in South Africa. At Praekelt.org, we believe that basic information is a fundamental human right. And we've been working with governments over the last 10 years to build systems to provide access to health services and educational services throughout the continent. Mom Connect is one of those. In South Africa, more than 1 million mothers access information about their pregnancy and about their babies through a WhatsApp line and through their mobile devices. We've learned over the last couple of years how to provide not only information, but also guidance throughout the pregnancy. And we've learned how many different ways we can provide this guidance and how questions can be asked over a mobile device, not only via messaging, but also sometimes as video clips, audio clips, or images. So the building blocks were already in place with Mom Connect that we could repurpose for Health Alert in South Africa. So in a couple of weeks' time, in March of this year, we worked with the Department of Health to develop the content in more than 5 of South Africa's 11 languages that we could deliver over Health Alert. In the beginning, the service was quite simple. We provided information around case numbers, around the spread and the growth of the pandemic and the virus in South Africa, around basic information that you needed to keep yourself safe. We updated news every single day. We had information about fake news that was spreading throughout social networks. And we launched a health check that you could use to check your symptoms to know whether or not to go and get tested at a health facility, thereby alleviating the pressure on the health system and allowing them to concentrate on caring for the sick. It was a tremendous success. Over 500,000 people were accessing the line during lockdown at its peak. And over time, more than 25% of the adult population of South Africa, that's more than 8 million people, have shared more than 500 million pieces of content around COVID-19. Within a couple of weeks, we're discussing building on this success, working with the World Health Organization to launch a similar service around the world. And so a crack squad was pulled together from a bunch of technology organizations around the world, including WhatsApp, Amazon, the World Health Organization, obviously our team as well. And then with a couple of weeks, we reached more than 13 million people in over 18 languages. As the pandemic changes, our services also have to adapt. During the first stage of the pandemic, we mostly provided information in real time to all our citizens. But over time, we are starting to think about other effects, such as economic impact on our citizens, about the spread of vaccines and how to safely and equitably get the vaccine to billions of people around the world. Looking back over the platform and the successes of the last couple of months, I think it points towards a future where we can build services to safely and securely communicate with every single person on the planet and provide them the kind of health service they need to improve their lives. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gustav. And later on in the day, we'll share with you what Gustav and his team has done with the technology to extend it to other services or communities outside the health space. And that community is really one that is key to the South African economy, being the small businesses, small and medium-sized enterprises. So look out for the announcement on what SMEs can use the technology that is similar to the health technology that Praekelt Foundation has developed. At the end of 2018, the International Finance Corporation released a report titled The Unseen Sector. I remember looking at it thinking, unseen. And I thought, well, maybe depending on who's looking. And the report was really an analysis of South Africa's small and medium-sized enterprises. And according to the research, small businesses in South Africa employ up to 60% of the working force and contribute around 34% to the GDP. During the pandemic, the experiences of small businesses have really been a mixed bag. If anything, I think I speak as an entrepreneur to say it's been disappointing. A lot of businesses found themselves in a very difficult position where the government announced all sorts of relief packages, but for some reason, there were really huge challenges in accessing those benefits. Our next speaker is a journalist at the SABC, and she spent her time really looking at what is going on with small businesses during lockdown. Welcome to the TEDxJohannesburg stage, Liabo Setho.
On the 26th of January in 2020, I landed at the OR Tambo International Airport from Zurich in Switzerland. And I remember this day so vividly because throughout my journey, I had been staring at an Asian woman in the flight who had a surgical mask draped across her mouth and nose. And I remember thinking to myself, this virus must be so serious in China. Little did I know that this virus would be just as serious in South Africa. In fact, so serious that more than 20,000 people would have lost their lives by the end of November 2020, and that the word pandemic would form a large part of my vocabulary throughout the year. Obviously, weeks after that, I would be acquainted with the pandemic and also its devastating effects. At that time, fear and bravery coexisted. Fear, because I didn't know if I was going to make it out alive, but bravery because I couldn't wait to start visiting and reporting on my favorite community, the entrepreneurs and small and medium enterprises. I was certain that I would come across very interesting stories, but at times, doubt would creep in and ask, what if there are no businesses to report on? What if they are all closed? I stand before you today because, as you can imagine, fear lost out to optimism. Nothing was going to stop me from visiting them and reporting on their stories. You see, in the 36 weeks of lockdown in South Africa, I have also profiled 36 small businesses, small and medium enterprises that kept their doors open and also their inboxes to their social media accounts active during a pandemic. From Vuyo Dlamini, the founder of Timfoletinhle, she was stuck with rails of designer wear after customers cancelled their orders and traffic to their stores dramatically slowed. But she had to think creatively and out of the box to keep stock moving.
I've done a sale, major sale, where I'm offering 3 items for 1,000 rands. So this entire rail behind me, you know, it's, I think I counted about 120 items in the store that I could realistically add to this rail and recoup some of, you know, the monies that I've invested in the material and the labor.
Here I witnessed agility and persistence. During this time, I witnessed the often spoken about beast within an entrepreneur. It reminded me about the first rule of starting a business. What problem is your business solving or addressing? I saw those that looked at the pandemic in the eye and said, bring it on, and those that froze at the sight of a pandemic. Despite the uncertainty of this period, new businesses were born, like the cleaner who collaborated with a fashion designer and a paint manufacturer, and together they repurposed their working space to produce masks, surgical masks, of about 40,000 per day. The implementation of lockdown levels meant that small businesses now needed to be supported financially. In fact, the South African government made available 500 million rands or $32.4 million in debt relief funds. Various departments like the Department of Tourism made available about 200 million rands or $13 million to businesses within that sector, but only 4,000 ended up getting that funding. These were in principle useful interventions, but unfortunately, they failed to meet the immediate needs of small businesses at that time. For instance, some businesses did not meet the criteria needed in order to get the funding. Those that did had to compete for a limited pool in large numbers. And what most received at the end was an acknowledgement of their application as well as a reference number. According to the Department of Small Business and Development's own data, about 35,865 applications were received, but only 1,497 were approved for funding.
We've submitted we've registered on the online platform, but we haven't received response from them. And this has been an ongoing problem, I think, with other entrepreneurs and SMEs as well. You know, you go on Twitter, you find people talking about their frustrations in terms of receiving funding and all that.
The cries from the small business community about red tape and waiting for weeks on end for a response on their application was heart-wrenching. This meant that their survival could no longer be guaranteed in the absence of financial assistance. According to the World Economic Outlook update released in June 2020, global growth is projected to fall by 4.9% in 2020. This dire projection reminds us of the role and the importance of small businesses in building economic growth. In South Africa, small businesses are responsible for the creation of about 60% of jobs. Even before the pandemic knocked on our doors, the South African economy was already languishing in low economic growth for well over a decade. And this pandemic made things worse. And even in these circumstances, it has been an opportune time for small businesses to start thinking of smart ways to keep their heads above water. Of the 36 businesses that I spend time with, all of them say they've embraced technology and some are looking to become more innovative.
The user now has got virtually a waiter that is there at the table at all times, which is by the form of their mobile device.
Just from how our guys are thinking, how we are thinking, and how we've remodeled our business model has become much better because we've spotted the gaps in the quiet times and we've been able to maximize on those.
Now, a question to small businesses. What has the pandemic taught you about your own business?
I had a reckoning where I realized that my business is actually a luxury. When it comes to with everything that's happened, people are now having to choose bread or beauty. So I had to realize that I need to be a need and no longer a want.
It is during this time that I started to think about the next pandemics and if businesses would be better prepared for these pandemics and what does that preparation look like. Preparation is anticipation of a customer's needs. It is keeping compliance paperwork ready at all times. It is giving service to customers so that they can prepare for the next pandemic. And preparation is getting acquainted with technology and how it can be applied to make business agile and resilient. However, the biggest lesson is that we have to learn to establish businesses that are first for purpose before they are for profit. There's no bigger evidence than the current pandemic that running after profit only is fickle. What is clear about this pandemic is that it has changed the world. It has changed the way we do business, and it has also changed our social lives. The question, though, is what have small businesses learned during this pandemic, and would they be able to recover in the next pandemic? How ready is your business for the next major disruption?
Well, I hope that small businesses will continue to thrive, pivot, and really be ready for the next pandemic. Our next two speakers are colleagues, friends, connections of some of the people in our network. What we realized is that reporting during the pandemic has been very localized. Living here in Johannesburg, I hardly saw news about what was happening in other parts of the continent. In looking for what other countries have been doing, we found two speakers in the medical field. One is a medical doctor, a public health specialist who is originally from Rwanda and is currently based in Boston. And the second person is a medical student, actually in his final year of medicine, based in Morocco. And they're both going to share with us their experiences from their countries. Welcome to the TEDxJohannesburg stage, Anatole Manzi, followed by Saad Uakkas.
Early in the pandemic, I talked with my mom who lives in the same rural village in Rwanda where I grew up. I asked her how COVID-19 was affecting our community and whether she was following the safe practices around social distancing and staying home. Of course, she said, how can I go outside with the teachers out there? Keeping what? The teachers? And I flashed back to my own youth and how the teachers understood the situation of every household in my village and the kindness and the support they offered when we children were too hungry to stand. Along with my friends and colleagues, we founded a non-profit known as Move Up Global. Today, this organization has begun working with the teachers as frontline responders to COVID-19 pandemic. We see this as an essential element of an equity-based pandemic response. By now, we all should know that the action of every individual is crucial for pandemic control. To slow and eventually stop COVID-19, we health professionals ask people to socially distance, to use a personal protective equipment, PPEs, and if they are sick or exposed to someone who is sick, to get tested immediately and to quarantine and self-isolate, and frequently wash hands with soap and clean water. When we ask this, we are often asking the impossible. Asking the impossible of people who live in a multi-generational households or crowded conditions, who have no money to buy soap, and who often are food insecure, and who have no access to PPE, and who need to walk long distance, hours and hours to visit a nurse or a doctor. An equity-based response ensures that everyone both knows how to protect themselves and protect their families, and has the means to do so. Especially in impoverished areas of Africa, whether urban or rural, teachers can play an important part in implementing this response. With over 65% of the population under the age of 35, Africa has the youngest population. This is about 133 million. Many are in school, and although many schools have no nurse, no counselor, no doctor, they have the teachers. And Africa's youth spend more time with the teachers than anyone else outside their family. It's teachers who know best their household situation and what steps needed to respond. The question is how teachers can play a role by virtue of their proximity to the community, of their skills as educators, and of their commitment to their students and to their social welfare. Teachers are the best suited to be rapidly trained and equipped as a greatly expanded public health workforce. An expanded workforce is needed right now, more than ever before. You see, while 445 healthcare workers are recommended for 100,000 people, the World Health Organization reported that 46 out of 47 countries have significantly less than this figure. For instance, in Rwanda, there are 10 doctors for every 100,000 people, while in Kenya, there are 20. And in Botswana, there are 40. So now, if we want to rely on conventional roles and training, it would take decades and decades for the healthcare workers to be prepared and to be able to respond to pandemics alone. In my community, efforts are underway to train teachers to screen their students for COVID-19 and neglected tropical diseases. Teachers are designing a robust soap-making project, school-based soap-making project to enhance hand hygiene conditions. Such actions must be taken on a grand scale. You see, when 70 children file into a classroom, 70 families are in the same room. Teachers must be given the tools they need. Every teacher should be armed with the necessary knowledge and skills to detect and prevent the spread of COVID-19. Teachers should have thermometers, should have PPEs to protect themselves, protect the students, and most importantly, have an emergency response kit for at-risk families. The question that you may have now is, are teachers up to the job? Absolutely. The reality is that life will never be the same. In education, as in every sphere of life, we must have an adaptive response. And this includes an adaptive curriculum. You know, in many African countries, the public school curricula now being used is the same taught 50 years ago under the colonial rule. It's time to adapt. And the pandemic preparedness and response should be a core component of health education. For teachers, this will become an integrated new skill set and a competency that they can pass on to their students. During pandemics, the best way to show a universal compliance to infection control measures is to show an example. And teachers can do that. It's what they do. COVID-19 is not the first, and for sure, it is not the last pandemic. We've had cholera, HIV/AIDS, TB, Ebola, and now, a few years after Ebola, we have COVID-19. I have a privilege to serve as Deputy Chief Medical Officer at Partners in Health, a global health organization which champions social justice. And over the past 15 years, my team and I designed strategies to enhance health systems across over 10 countries that we support. In all pandemics, building and deploying a robust community workforce, including community health workers, teachers, faith leaders, traditional healers, has been the secret of our rapid response and remarkable success. The best way to be prepared for the next pandemic is to think ahead and build an extended workforce which can make a real-time change in the lives of students and their families. If we need this change, an intentional adaptation of our public health programming has to happen. First, it will need some humility. a willingness to recognize that teachers can do or do more than the writing on a blackboard. Building a strong linkage between health and education system, that will have to happen. And finally, it will require us to adapt the national policies and to embrace the role of teachers as extended workforce. Teachers are one of the beloved communities, and they model the behavior, the values, and the essential knowledge needed to build a better world and to survive a pandemic no matter your income and station in life. Thank you.
Wow. I didn't look at teachers like that. I knew they play an important role in society, in the community, but I think what Anatole has exposed us to is something that, at least from where I am, I haven't really been thinking of. How do we expand the workforce in the health space? We all know that, the medical profession, they are all strained. But if you look beyond the health workers and look to teachers and other members of the community, surely we can beat the next virus.
Yeah, and on that note, we go all the way to North Africa, in Morocco, to find a young man who's doing great work. Amazing work, he's got great energy. Saad, welcome to the TEDx Johannesburg stage, my friend.
Once upon a time, there has been a farmer who used to go to the river every day to bring water to his family. One day, one of his 2 pots cracked and the poor farmer couldn't afford to fix it. Days went in while the cracked pot kept leaking water, and all the farmer could do is continue walking and feeling sad about it. Spring came and the farmer realized how the leaking water gave birth to hundreds of flowers throughout the road. Today, COVID-19 cracked our lives. We all felt sad about it. And so many people still struggle to feel positive or to overcome the consequences of the pandemic. And this is why I'm here today, to share with you one golden lesson that I learned from 9-month experience as a medical doctor in the emergency room in my hospital here in Morocco. I've seen so many vulnerable patients, so many being brought to the hospital after attempting suicide or after having severe depression or anxiety attacks. One of them, a 19-year-old girl who attempted to end her life by taking medication, and after talking to her privately, I realized the girl had severe depression, loss of hope in life, and lack of support from her family and best friends. Today, COVID-19 affected us all, either our education, our work, our personal or professional relationships, and it made us all vulnerable like this girl. I remember so many patients coming to the hospital with beating marks in their faces, in their hands, in their bodies, especially women, day and night. One time at 2 a.m., a man came in being severely injured by his drunk wife, and he was begging us to let him stay in the hospital for the night because he couldn't get back home, and with the lockdown measures, he couldn't go anywhere else. And this is how COVID is affecting our families and our personal relations. Yet, so many people still speak about the importance of economical effects and tackling those issues related to social effects of COVID. But for me, the real issue and the real matter is the human capital, is being us as humans able to support ourselves and to thrive during the pandemic. 5 months ago, we did a study with 4 global youth organizations about COVID and youth, and we found out that mental health was the second most concerning issue for youth in the pandemic period. We also found that 58% of young people were negatively affected in mental health caused to the pandemic. A similar survey conducted by the International Labour Organization found out that at least 1 in 2 young people will possibly suffer from anxiety or depression because of the pandemic. A very serious issue to tackle, yet it doesn't need a miracle or a fortune to solve. It only needs care for each other. I remember those days when I was in the hospital wearing those tight protective suits to go and treat COVID patients. It used to give me the courage and the resilience to go and fight the disease. And similarly, when you care and cherish each other, you share the positivity, the courage and the resilience they need to fight the consequences of the pandemic. One of those days, I was in hospital surviving my 24-hour shift, hungry, tired. I had no lunch, unfortunately, too much work. Out of nowhere, a 24-year-old girl comes in. She handed me a bottle of water and a colorful paper saying thank you. I still remember seeing that girl 1 week earlier in coma because of her uncontrolled diabetes. She wrote a poem for me, thanking me for helping her and helping other patients. And let me tell you something. At that moment, my hunger and my tiredness weren't an issue anymore. That feeling was positivity and energy which helped me survive the day, and that little gesture of kindness gave me the energy and made me feel valued and recognized. And this is what care is about. Caring for each other doesn't mean making some special gift or gesture. It can be as simple as calling your people, your friends, your family, asking them how they are doing, if they were fine, and if you can help them somehow. 3 questions that you can do after listening to this talk. You can talk to people, show them that you are there for them and that they are not alone. And as Oprah Winfrey said, life is a reciprocal exchange. If you want to move forward, you have to give back. So if you want people to care about you, you have to care about people first. During the past 7 years, I worked as a young activist in different NGOs. I traveled to 20 countries trying to solve different problems and challenges related to youth and public health. I also worked as a trainer to educate and empower and build the capacity of youth in different levels. I have lived the magic and power that education can have on lives people, and this is my second step to surviving the next pandemic. So here is a question for you. How many people here know what are the 5 steps of mental health first aid? Let's say you don't know, okay? So if you spend 5 minutes searching and reading about it, you will have a rough idea about what you should do and should not do if you face a similar case. How great is that? Now, if you spend a couple of hours doing a free online course about mental health first aid, you will have the ability to offer advanced support to people in need. Isn't that awesome? Dave Chappelle once said, modern problems require modern solutions. And with the COVID-19 pandemic and the new normal, there are several sets of skills that can make our lives better and easier, and we can start learning them right away. So today I just want you to get out of that comfort zone of yours, go read a book, read resources, watch a video, an online course, download an app, whatever suits you people. Just keep learning. Now, of course, when you do that, there will still be many other issues and challenges caused by the pandemic that needs to be solved. And here is where our third and final step comes in hand. Helping others and contributing to change. In the past year, I've been acting as the liaison officer to students' organizations and the coordinator of the COVID campaign in the International Federation of Medical Students Associations, IFMSA, where I have been guiding and supporting medical students for more than 90 countries to work on COVID. I have seen young people educating others, raising awareness, creating innovations and creative solutions, supporting vulnerable populations by giving them food and sanitations, volunteering in call centers, and doing different kinds of actions to help alleviate the impact that COVID had on their communities. Now here is my question for you today. How many hours per week do you volunteer for your community? And believe me, it's not something difficult at all. The amount of rewarding you feel when you help others and you help contribute to solving their problems is limitless. My friends, the past 9 months have been really life-changing for me. I have seen so many people suffering and struggling from the pandemic. I have also seen so many people standing up, growing themselves, and spreading positivity. And my lesson for you today is that no matter how bad the COVID-19 pandemic or any other pandemic cracks our lives, if we stand up and keep walking and keep improving ourselves, if we keep watering our community and watering others by helping them and supporting them, we will be able to grow flowers of positivity and resilience, and we will be able to survive the next pandemic. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Saad is coming to us from the beautiful Moroccan city of Kenitra, I believe. Yeah, beautiful, beautiful city.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Let's flower each other, right? Quite an amazing talk. Well done, Saad, all the way up north. if you are watching, please go on Twitter and just share your experience of the conference with us. Just follow us on TEDxJohannesburg, TEDxJohannesburg. And if you're tweeting, use the hashtag surviving pandemics. I just want to go through some of the tweets that we have received so far from Gugu Jadu. She was quite impressed with Liabo's talk. And she says, Liabo killed it, excellent presentation. Thank you for representing the voice of small, micro, and medium enterprises. Quite an amazing talk from Liabo. And some of the tweets from Joburg, in the absence of TEDxJohannesburg, in the absence of real data, you run the risk of people imagining what is happening. Making data public gives people information that they can interrogate themselves. Another one, and this little gesture of kindness gave me the positivity and energy I needed to survive my day. It made me feel recognized and valued. And that's Saad. We just saw him right now. So if you have any, experiences, maybe share with us your pandemic experience. How has lockdown kept you? How are you managing? If there are any other tricks or tips that you want to share with us, just feel free to come through and share them on our Twitter page at TEDxJohannesburg and hashtag surviving pandemics. This conference is brought to you by TEDx and in partnership with the Skoll Foundation. One of the amazing things when the pandemic started, Tati, was when the lockdown started, was seeing people in balconies and coming out and playing violin and playing music across, and you have all this music that's playing out. And that was quite an amazing experience of people coming together in lockdown, but through music. Let's continue from where we left off with Kabelo in terms of what he was playing for us. Aluta continue. The struggle continues.
The next song I will play will be Aluta Continua, meaning the struggle continues. So definitely the struggle continues for us to beat this pandemic. So it's the song behind, the mask for me that keeps me smiling every day, knowing that things will be all right soon. So I hope you do enjoy it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kabelo. And yeah, keep on, doing the amazing work. One of the pertinent questions that is came through during the pandemic is what has been the role or the voice of women during the COVID pandemic? What are the voices? Are they well represented, women's voices? To help us respond to these questions, we have Luba Kassova.
Imagine that you've woken up in a world where the volume of women's voices has been turned down to 2, whilst the volume of men's voices has been turned up to 10. A world where women's voices are hardly heard by the police or politicians or the news media. This was the world that many Generation Xers like me grew up in, where I come from. In that world, I was advised to try to be less vocal than men and to give way to men's opinions. I saw my mother and many of my friends' mothers stand in the shadow of their husbands' professional accomplishments. And I didn't question the status quo. Not until a few years ago, after numerous conversations, I decided that these values that put men at the center of society in its public dimensions, which we call patriarchal values, were outdated in the UK, where I now live. I waved goodbye to the past and moved forward optimistically into what I believed was the new world of gender equality. It is in the context of examining this world that I'm here now. My work passion is to help organizations to understand human beings and to put men and women alike at the heart of their decision making, rather than to rely solely on their leaders' gut feel. It was this focus of my work that led the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to ask me to investigate the role of women in news media and to explore the extent to which women's voices as opposed to men's are heard. So today I'm standing before you having written 2 reports on the subject, both during the first wave of the COVID pandemic. They have been based on analysis of millions of news stories by Media Ecosystems Analysis Group and of thousands of sources examined by my consultancy ACAS. And through them I have uncovered a painful truth, that the world in the past I asked you to visualize earlier is actually the world that news media presents today. News today is still predominantly a man's affair, whether you're in the global south or in the global north. It reports on a world where decisions are made mainly by men and where women's voices are largely unheard, even amid the most consequential crisis of the 21st century to date, the COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit women particularly hard across many dimensions: economic, social, political, cultural and psychological. I'm also standing before you as a mother who, like millions of others this year, bore the brunt of unpaid work during the lockdown, struggling to educate my children and to keep a household going while working intensely at the same time. I feel deeply for women around me who were forced to give up their jobs due to lack of suitable childcare, or whose job security disappeared during lockdown. The tensions they and we have lived through were summarized potently in the headline of an FT article posing the question: is the coronavirus crisis taking women back to the 50s? When friends and family ask me what I have been working on, I tell them that I have been investigating to what extent women in 6 countries across the globe, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, India, the UK and the US, express their views in the news on important matters, such as how COVID impacts their lives. At this point, friends typically ask me what I found. So I invite them to imagine an a cappella choir of 32 people singing an ode to economics. 31 of them are men and 1 is a woman. Do you think that the woman's solitary voice is being heard or being lost, I ask. It's being lost, they say. Indeed it is. This is the evidence that I have found, that women's share of voice in the news is being largely lost. In 2019, on the topic of the economy, men's voices outnumbered women's voices by a factor of up to 31. For news in general, the story was somewhat better, but still depressing. For every woman who expressed her perspective in the news in 2019, there were up to 6 men drowning it out. So what, people say? Why does it matter whether women are in the news or not, as long as the news objectively reports reality? Well, this is where we're forced to acknowledge a fallacy. The fallacy that an objective reality exists somewhere out there. Research on how the news has been framed in recent decades has shown that there is no such thing as an objective reality a journalist dispassionately describes. The decisions about what to report and what constitutes the reality of a situation are intricately linked to one of many possible perspectives. What journalists choose to focus on is as important as what they choose to leave out of their story. How they define a problem, what has caused it, and what solutions could resolve it are one slice of the reality among many that journalists can choose to present. And their decisions about what story to tell impact lives and livelihoods. Let me take aspects of the COVID news story as an example of reality being more often than not omitted from reporting. When women are left out of COVID news coverage, whether sources, experts or main characters in the news story, we, the public, don't hear about their unique problems such as how disempowering and scary it feels to be left out of COVID testing, which happens in some socially conservative countries, or how tough it is to combine childcare and care for the parents and spouses with work, or how devastating it is to be stuck in a confined space with a violent partner, or how petrifying it is to be denied an antenatal checkup because resources have been redirected away from maternal health care towards containing the pandemic, or how unfathomably painful it is not only to lose a husband to COVID-19, but also your home, because it was he who owned it. When women-centered, all too frequently experienced stories such as these remain untold, it leads the politicians responsible for designing social policies in response to the pandemic to miss out from their policy making a whole raft of issues that are unique to women. And since most politicians are themselves men, social policies become very male-centered, just like the news itself. The situation triggers endless questions. Why is it that in the 21st century, news coverage across all 6 countries, the team researched globally, is facing a universal problem? Women's voices are muted across the whole life cycle of a news story, starting from the editors who make the decisions about what news to run, followed by the voices amplified in the news, and finishing with those who consume the news, including those who have the power to introduce political and social changes as a result of the news they have consumed. Why is it that in news stories men are up to 6 times more likely than women to appear as the main characters? And even when the news coverage is about gender issues, the majority of the main characters in it are still men. It's as if the female solo part in the choir has been given to the man with the highest pitched voice. Why is it that of the people who were portrayed in COVID-19 news coverage as empowered, the positive role models that young people live up to, only 17% were women and 83% were men? Why is it that women who are victims of crime are treated less compassionately in news coverage than men, and more harshly when they are the perpetrators? And why is it that one political story we came across focused on the appearance of women politicians, referencing their body odor and sexual behavior in a derogatory way, but did not do the same for the men politicians who featured in the same story? The answer to this question is that we live in societies where patriarchal norms still dominate or linger in our collective consciousness. And these are mirrored in news organizations and news coverage. Interestingly, when I put this forward as the reason behind men's dominance in news, it often somehow falls flat. There is a silence. Is that it? Is the latent question I hear in that silence. The truth is, people and organizations often don't take this reason seriously enough. In countries in the global north, people frequently think that patriarchal values are a thing of the past. In the global south, people often think that gender equality has progressed far enough. In both cases, we're sleepwalking through a reality that is vastly different from what we think it is. The most heartbreaking consequence of all this is that it is exceedingly difficult to fix something which is not seen as broken. Many men and women, particularly from the global south, believe that changes that enable women's rights have gone far enough in their country, suggesting that they see the situation as satisfactory. At the same time, astonishingly, more than half of men and women in Nigeria, approximately a third in South Africa, and more than 1 in 10 in the UK and US believe that it is acceptable for a man to beat his wife. And distressingly, the vast majority of men and women in South Africa, India, Nigeria, and a significant minority in the UK and US hold anti-women biases. It seems to me that this is a situation that demands action, and there are steps we can take. The first step to tackling women's marginalization in news globally lies in accepting that pro-male biases exist and acknowledging that patriarchal values are still woven into the very fabric of our societies. The second step is to feel uncomfortable about this fact. There are 3 sets of solutions that address the issue of women's underrepresentation in news. The first centers around increasing the awareness of the problem. The second seeks to remove the barriers to women being heard in the news. The third set of solutions is focused on nudging new habits or creating new initiatives. A great tried and tested example of a solution aimed at raising awareness of the problem is simply asking journalists to count how many men versus how many women feature in the news coverage that they produce. This is how the successful BBC 50-50 project started. When journalists do this, invariably most of them are surprised to find that the proportion of women is much lower than they thought. For those who are unconvinced of the importance of this, an effective way of helping journalists to care about the gender imbalance in news coverage is to offer gender sensitivity training across the whole organization, from the governance structure, which typically is heavily male-dominated, all the way down to the journalists in newsrooms. Another successful solution, this time aimed at removing barriers to women's voices being heard in news, is to put together lists of women experts, not only scientists, political figures and medical experts, but also paramedic, nurses or educators. This has been tested and shown to work well. Lists make it easier for busy journalists to quickly find women expert sources who can feature in their reports. Developing checklists that journalists can use when they want to bring in a woman-centered angle in a story, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, is also effective in providing a cue for developing a new habit, as is argued by behavioral scientists. These checklists could include key COVID-related topics that are relevant to women, such as health and healthcare, employment, gender-based violence, childcare and education. The American writer Rebecca Solnit once said, "Who is heard and who is not defines the status quo. By redefining whose voice is valued, we redefine our society and its values." The Nigerian writer Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said, "Culture does not make people, people make culture." So allow me to leave you with this appeal. Next time you consume the news, ask yourself, whose perspectives are being amplified in the news? Is there harmony and balance between men and women in the news choir? Can I hear women's voices distinctly? If the answer to the last 2 questions is no, then choose to act. Question, post, tweet, comment, write, complain, debate. If you're a journalist, look for women experts, main characters and sources to feature in your stories. Once you have found them, please give them a voice to bring a much needed harmony and gender balance to the powerful global news choir. Thank you.
Yeah, quite sobering. Yeah, just as you think we're making progress, it turns out that no, actually, we are far from where we should be. Thank you so much for the incredible work, Luba. I take my hat off to Luba for the amazing work she's been doing. The research, and she is launching the second report today, as she mentioned. I look forward to hopefully getting a chance to ask a few questions about that later on in the program. We will be having a Q&A at the end of this session. And if there's any questions that you want to ask Luba, please fire away on the chat or go to our Twitter and just ask your questions on Twitter. One of the biggest challenges that we had to face during the pandemic, especially during the lockdown, is defining the COVID pandemic as a health crisis. But as time went on, we saw that actually it also became a crisis of livelihoods, poverty, access to food have been challenges that a lot of people have experienced. Our next speaker, Mervyn Abrahams, is an economic justice advocate. He's based in Pietermaritzburg and he does the work of economic justice and dignity group. He's going to unpack for us the impact that this pandemic has had on poverty, on food and food pricing. Let's welcome on stage Mervyn Abrahams.
Household food insecurity and increasing food prices have been a systemic challenge in South Africa for decades. The COVID-19 pandemic and the resultant lockdown has exposed, brought into public view, the fault lines of inequality in accessing sufficient and nutritious food, as we saw long queues of people seeking food aid. A major contributor to the increase in food insecurity during the lockdowns have been increasing food prices without a comparable increase in household incomes. Over the 9-month period, we saw the cost of our food basket increase by 10%. We need to remember that most South Africans are net buyers of food. We source our food in supermarkets, and in order to access that food, we need money, we need cash. How much money we have and the price of the foods that we buy determines whether households can access sufficient and nutritional food to meet their nutritional needs. Access to food also tells us something about the deficit in wages and in incomes, as well as how our economy is doing. The Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Household Affordability Index tracks food price inflation for low-income households in South Africa. We track the price inflation of 44 basic foods that women in low-income households tell us, through means of focus groups around the country, tell us they typically try and buy each month, should they have sufficient money. The quantities in our food basket are designed for a household of 7 persons, the average number of people in low-income households in South Africa. Because women do the shopping, women prepare the meals, women make the decisions on the food budget, they are best placed to provide the data that we receive. And so women data collectors collect food price data at 44 supermarkets and 30 butcheries that target low-income households in Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, Pietermaritzburg, and in Springbok in the Northern Cape. What is in our basket? As I've mentioned before, our basket contains 44 foods. Amongst these are 30 kgs of maize meal, 10 kgs of rice, 10 kgs of cake flour, 5 kgs of sugar beans, 5 liters of cooking oil, 10 kgs of potatoes, 10 kgs of onions, 6 kgs of tomatoes, 25 loaves of brown bread. All foods absolutely necessary for low-income households. Now let us have a look at food price inflation during the COVID period. When we look at November 2019, a year ago, the cost of that basket of 44 foods was $204. By March of 2020, as the COVID-19 lockdown was implemented across the country, our basket cost $211, an increase of $7 between November 2019 and March 2020. By November 2020, this month, the cost of that basket has increased to $233. This means that during the 9 months of the COVID-19 lockdown, the price of our basket of food has increased by $22 or 10% in value. When we look at the cost of our basket year on year, November 2019 to November 2020, we then see that the cost of the basket has increased by $29 or 14%. When we compare wage increases over the same period, then we see that the national minimum wage has increased year on year by 3.4%, while our basket of food has increased by 14%. As the price of food is increasing much faster than wage inflation, then it becomes incumbent on households to have to cut back on the amount of food that they consume or the nutritional value of the food that they consume. The main driver of our food inflation have been the core or staple foods. So for instance, maize meal increased by 14%, rice increased by 29%, sugar beans increased by 60%, cooking oil increased by 16%, potatoes increased by a whopping 70% over this 9-month period, and 25 loaves of brown bread increased by 21%. And so what are the implications of this continuing food price increases without comparable increase in household income? Women tell us that they must buy the core foods, no matter the price. You have to buy maize meal, you have to buy rice, you have to buy potatoes and onions in order to cook a meal to put on the plate. And so when the price of these core foods increase, without income also increasing, then they have to buy less food or less nutritional food. So they drop out of the trolley foods such as meat, milk, fresh produce, food rich in nutrition, food rich in iron, calcium, protein, fiber, vitamins, and minerals. The only foods that get bought are the foods that fill the tummies, but largely only contain starch and sugar. And so the plates in low-income households gets whiter and nutritional diversity disappear from the plates. What are the implications of continuously increasing food prices? Firstly, in a time of a pandemic, we need our immune system in order to fight the virus should we contract it. Not having sufficient nutrition means that our immune system becomes compromised and will not be able to fight the virus should we contract it. We are more likely to end up with non-communicable diseases. Diseases such as high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, which are all the result of chronic undernutrition. Women in South Africa have the highest statistics for non-communicable diseases. Why women? Because they tell us they eat last. And by the time they dish food for themselves, all the best nutrition have been dished up for the children and other members of the household. We also require good nutrition for economic growth and productivity. Because if you are hungry, hungry workers are not innovative, and hungry workers cannot be productive. And so all our socio-economic and development outcomes has at its basis good nutrition in the household. It is cheaper to resist illness through the plate than through increasing investment in hospitals and healthcare. Undernutrition means that we do not get the value of the investment that we as a country make in education, because hungry children cannot learn. Stunted children cannot learn properly. And in South Africa, we already have about 30% of boy children, 25% of girl children under the age of 25 who are stunted. Those children are more likely to enter the workforce as laborers, more likely to earn lower wages than other workers, and more likely not to be able to afford sufficient and nutritional food for their children. And so the intergenerational cycle of poverty continues, because our socio-economic and development outcomes is based on good nutrition. Food is at the basis of our human need. But in a market economy such as ours, accessing sufficient and nutritious food is dependent on how much money I have in the pocket and the price of the food I wish to purchase. What we have seen during COVID-19 is that food price inflation rises much faster and much steeper than does wages and household incomes. And this results in the inequality in access to sufficient and nutritious food for low-income households. And so if we are to move to a new society beyond COVID-19, we are going to have to become extremely serious to provide each and every household sufficient and nutritious food. And that will require having the income to purchase that food, because South Africans are net buyers of food. We will require food price stability, and we will require increased wages. Those are the only means through which we will be able to bridge the levels of inequality that exist in our society today.
Okay, massive thanks to the guys back at, what is it? It's Mervyn and his team.
Yes.
It's a bit of a long name, Pietermaritzburg Center for, it's there, we'll come back to it, but massive thanks to them for the great work that they're doing. Rosh, it does look like South Africa has a long way to go still, you know, in terms of taking care of those who are the most vulnerable in society.
It's becoming an increasingly difficult task. I mean, even before, I think one of the speakers alluded to the fact that, I think Liabo spoke about the fact that even before the pandemic, the economy was already in trouble. And now with COVID, you know, we are steps up behind to solve the issue. Just keep tweeting your thoughts, your questions. We are going to do a Q&A just after our last speaker. Just to go on Twitter, I see one of the tweets from Liabo. Kabelo Motlhomi is amazing. I could listen to him all day. Where can I find his music? Kabelo has got a website, kabelo.violin.co.za. His contact details are there, and you can order directly from him. We've come to, the last speaker. Unbelievable. Amazing content, amazing work that people are doing out there. 2 days ago, on the 1st of December, it was World AIDS Day. Yeah. And, one of couple of the observations that have been made is that it seems like COVID pandemic has stolen the focus from HIV and AIDS. And as a result, people are no longer even going to collect their medications. What has been that impact of COVID on HIV and AIDS? And what lessons can we learn from how we deal with COVID that we can actually use to fight another serious pandemic, which is HIV and AIDS? To help us respond to these questions, we have Professor Lynn Morris. Lynn is a principal medical scientist in the Center for HIV and STI at the National Institute for Communicable Diseases. Let's welcome to the TEDx Johannesburg stage, Professor Lynn Morris.
I'm a laboratory-based scientist, and for the last 25 years of my career, I've been trying to make a vaccine to HIV. And now we have 3 vaccines for COVID in less than a year. How did this happen? Well, the COVID vaccines benefited a lot from the years of investment in HIV vaccines. And what I want to tell you about today is how we can use that momentum to speed up the development of an HIV vaccine. But first, let's look at these 2 viruses. They certainly have some similarities. As you can see, they are small microscopic viruses, and you need very powerful microscopes to see them, but there's also some significant differences. So SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, is spread via the respiratory route. So that's simply breathing, and it means that everybody is susceptible. This virus causes an acute infection. That means it's very short-lived, and the body is able to clear the virus. And as we know, that happens in most people. And that's because our bodies make an immune response to the virus, particularly neutralizing antibodies, which develop in almost everybody. Another important feature is that this virus is very stable. So the 60 million people around the world that have been infected with this virus are infected with a very related virus. There are some differences, but it is very similar. Now, HIV, in contrast, causes a chronic infection. And that means it's a lifelong infection. And that's because this virus integrates into our genetic material, into our DNA. The other major factor is that the neutralizing antibody response here is very slow and ineffective. And then another major hurdle for HIV vaccine development is the virus mutates, and it really is a moving target. Now, vaccines have been one of our most successful ways of dealing with infectious diseases. And most vaccines work by inducing neutralizing antibodies. These are part of our immune response. And neutralizing antibodies work because they specifically bind to parts of the virus. In this case, it's the spike protein which surrounds the SARS-CoV-2 particle. So it's actually a physical interaction. The antibody binds to the spike and stops the virus from infecting cells. And that's what it means by neutralizing. So let's have a closer look at this SARS-CoV-2 protein. So this is what causes the spikes or the corona around the virus. And scientists have been able to look at this at what's called a very high resolution. And in fact, again, it's HIV scientists who turned their attention to looking at the SARS-CoV-2 protein. Partly that's because of the urgency, but also because a lot of funding was made available for people to study COVID-19. But what we've learned from the structure of the spike protein is that the part that's targeted by the antibodies is a very focused part. That's the part that's colored in red. And so that is the major target that we're looking, because that is the part of the protein that binds to the cells. Now, a number of different vaccines have been made against COVID-19. And again, it's really benefited from the vaccine development that's been taking place for decades with HIV. And so this just shows you some of the different approaches that have been taken. And many of you will now, I think they're now household names, some of these vaccine manufacturers. So the genetic vaccines, which are composed of the RNA or the DNA of the virus, of the spike protein, are used to stimulate an immune response. These same genes are also put into what is called a viral vector, so it's a harmless virus, to actually carry these genes into the body, almost like a Trojan horse. So in these kinds of vaccines, the body is in fact making the spike protein. We're actually making our own vaccine in a way. The third kind of vaccine is called a protein vaccine. And this is where we make the protein in the laboratory and then use that to immunize people. And this is a much more traditional approach to vaccine development. And it takes a lot longer and is actually much more expensive. So there's certainly, and it's been widely reported in the media about, this incredible effort to develop a COVID vaccine. And now we know we already have 3 that have shown that they work, that they have a high level of efficacy. The 2 RNA vaccines were shown to have over 90% efficacy, and the vectored vaccine also had very good efficacy. But as you can see from what's called this pipeline, there are another 10 that are still undergoing testing, and certainly are, we suspect that they're also going to work. And you can see that in the earlier phases of testing, there are a large number of vaccines. So we have a very, very robust pipeline for COVID vaccine development. And although none have been licensed as yet, that is also very, very imminent. In contrast, in the 20 years of doing HIV vaccine trials, we've only ever done 6 efficacy trials in 20 years. So just to give you a sense of the difference in how we're tackling these 2 viruses. But I don't want to make it sound as if HIV vaccine development is easy, because it isn't. It's actually one of the biggest challenges of our time. And that's really because this virus does change. So we, the laboratory that I run at the NICD, has been looking at how to develop these broadly neutralizing antibodies in infected people. And we discovered during this process that the virus is changing to create the kinds of stimuli that you need to get the right kinds of antibodies. And so this evolutionary process is now being incorporated into vaccine design. And so the paradigm is that we'll need to have different vaccines in order to shepherd the antibody response along so it can become a neutralizing antibody response. And that's just shown graphically here. So this is the equivalent of the spike protein in HIV is called the envelope protein. And so each of those different colors shows that it's a slightly different envelope protein in order to basically, as I say, coax the immune response along the right pathway to make neutralizing antibodies. So certainly in terms of vaccine development, HIV presents some significant challenges. So I participated in a COVID vaccine trial, the Novavax trial, that's been run by Wits University. And I did that because I really believe in vaccines. I believe in the power of vaccines. And also because I am vulnerable, just like everybody else, to being infected by SARS-CoV-2. So I had 2 vaccinations, and I sort of imagined this protein circulating in my body and my B cells trying to hunt it down so it could produce the right kinds of antibodies in order to protect me. During this time, one keeps a vaccine diary. You keep track of your your temperatures, whether there's any swelling or redness. And there really was very minor, pretty similar to an insect bite that really resolved within a few days. Of course, I don't know yet if I'm on the placebo or the active arm of the vaccine. That will only be found out later. And that's really a critical thing for, for determining how a vaccine works, is to measure the immune responses in people who've been vaccinated and to determine what's called the correlate of protection. So we need to know what levels of antibodies the vaccine needs to stimulate in order to protect people from infection. And that's what these trials are going to show. So a very critical thing. And in fact, once we have the correlate of protection, actually the vaccine development process is going to speed up even further. But I also, we've been learning as we go with this epidemic that we still have many unknowns. So we don't know how long immunity is going to last. We don't know if these vaccines are going to work for everybody. Though there's certainly good signs that they do work in older people, who of course are a major target group. We're not sure if we're measuring exactly the right immune responses, because there may be other things that we are still to discover. And I think a very critical thing is, will the virus change in the same way that it changes with HIV and represent a problem? Once a number of people have immunity to SARS, it's going to put pressure on the virus. And so that is one of the things that we certainly need to keep track of. So now I want to look at the global devastation caused by these two epidemics. So the top graph shows the number of deaths caused by SARS-CoV-2 per week since the start of the outbreak. And what you can see is in the purple is the first wave that occurred in Europe, and you can see the resurgence now that's happening. And then you can see the high level and ongoing level of deaths in the Americas. And what is most disturbing about this graph is that the resurgence levels are higher than the initial levels, and really speaks to the urgent need to start deploying these these efficacious vaccines. Because if we don't, these waves will keep happening. This virus will become endemic, and it will keep spreading amongst susceptible people. So far, in 11 months, 1.4 million people have died of COVID-19, and we certainly don't want to be getting to the levels that we see with HIV of 35 million people. So the reason why there's 35 million people who have died from HIV is because HIV has been with us for a very long time. And as you know, we don't have a vaccine. But what we do have is we do have good antiretroviral therapies. And you can see the effect of those on the graph below. So at the peak of the AIDS epidemic, approximately 1.6 million people were dying per year. And that decline was when antiretroviral therapy started being widely used. But it's not going to get us to zero, because antiretroviral therapy treats infected people. What we need to prevent people from getting infected, and that's why we need a vaccine. So we need that vaccine to get that curve right down. Just last year, 2019, over 700,000 people died of HIV. So the other important thing about this graph is the colors. So you can see that it's mostly red, and that's because HIV is mostly affects the African continent. But we also know historically that vaccine development, or Africa has been very neglected in terms of developing vaccines for diseases that affect the African continent. So what can we learn from COVID-19 that will help us to develop an HIV vaccine more rapidly? So what we need to be doing is developing and testing multiple candidates. We need a robust pipeline, the same way that we're doing with COVID. We need to be testing lots of different concepts, testing them all at the same time. We certainly need to be testing the mRNA vaccines, which were originally developed for HIV, but now are being tested for COVID. We need to go back, and we need to be doing that. We also need to run parallel processes. So while we're testing, we need to be manufacturing, and we need to be seeking approvals. It's high risk, but it fast tracks the process. And we certainly need more money. So COVID-19, the amount of money spent on COVID-19 is 8 to 10 times higher than the funding for HIV vaccines in any given year. And we know that money drives innovation. It attracts the best scientists and the best industries into the, into this area. It helps us run more trials. Vaccine development is expensive and it is high risk. We also need more industry involvement. We've certainly seen that in COVID. Many industries, including industries that have never been involved in vaccine development, are now getting involved. But we do need to incentivize them. And one of the ways to incentivize them is, of course, to give them advance commitments. So our governments need to do that. They need to say that we will buy the vaccine if it's shown to be safe and efficacious. So there's no doubt that the COVID vaccine is going to have a major impact. It's going to turn this epidemic around. It'll save lives and it'll save livelihoods. What we need now is to also develop a vaccine against HIV so that we can do the same. We need to attract the best people into this area. We need to use what we've learned in developing COVID vaccines. We need to apply that to HIV so that we can have an AIDS-free world. Thank you.
So on that poignant note, we switch the discussion, at least we end this part of the discussion, and we switch it to the Q&A, right?
Yes.
And while I'm finding my guests, my panelists, Kabelo will hold a discussion with you.
What a marathon, 3.5 hours of pandemic science, lessons to be learned. I learned a lot, actually. It's been 2 months, just under 2 months. So the content has definitely become familiar. And I appreciate all the effort, specifically the speakers. Firstly, for the work that they do, because we are here and still able to talk about surviving the next pandemic, because they spend endless hours working to see how we can manage the situation. But secondly, for making time for us at what is probably the busiest time of their careers. I also want to thank the filming crews that we worked with. We worked with 2, 4, 6, 7 organizations here in Johannesburg, Tribe Collective. They were very kind to, come on board to film about 9 speakers. Luba's team in London, Anatole and his family in Boston in the US, Danjuma in Jalingo, that's Tabara State in Nigeria, Saad and his team in Kenitra in Morocco, Filmcraft in Durban, Gustav and the Calvary team in Cape Town. It's been a learning, and I really appreciate the effort that they made. The talks will be made available online at a later stage. But for now, we're going to switch to a few of the speakers for specific questions that some of you have asked.
Yeah, so we want to start with Luba.
Yeah?
Yeah, you're there. Okay.
I am. Let me start the video.
Okay.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
Hi, Tati. Very well. Thank you so much for having me today. It's been such an honor.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the contribution that you made to today's content, and the work that you're doing with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the work that you're doing through your own consultancy with Richard. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Luba, just a quick question, or a couple of quick questions. You are launching the second report today.
Yes.
What is the new report? What is the title of the new report, and what does it cover that the first one didn't?
Oh, great questions. Thank you. So the title is "The Missing Perspectives of Women in News," it takes a much more historic and holistic perspective on women's representation in news across the whole value chain, starting from resources and newsrooms and news leadership, then news gathering, news coverage, news consumption, and news impact. It looks at the same 6 countries, and there are one of the very sad and shocking things that I was surprised by, and everyone who I speak with was surprised by, is that the fact that no improvement seems to have been made on any of the metrics we looked at in the countries from the global north or the global south. No significant improvement. It seems everything has flatlined. So the report looks at various root causes by exploring context, sociocultural, economic, political context, technological context, as well as audience context and regulatory, to understand why that's the case, which I already talked about in the talk. And also we present alternative narratives in the report for change. Because the narratives, obviously, that we've used so far haven't led to the desired outcome. And they need to be appealing particularly to men who are in power, because it is they who need to relegate some of their power for women to be heard in news coverage, but also to take more prominent leadership roles. And the narratives, alternative narratives, such as seeing women audiences as a source of competitive advantage for news models, which are currently under enormous pressure. That's something that's not explored enough, that the more newsmakers and news organizations appeal to women, the more eyeballs they have, and then they can grow their revenues. So this is one of many narratives that are explored in the report to move the conversation forward. There is also a checklist for news providers, and my big wish is that it's taken up, the checklist for news providers who want to improve their gender equality in their newsrooms, that they can, there are so many recommendations and things that they can do, and I hope that they take up that thinking.
Yeah, and we look forward to seeing it as soon as it comes out. I guess it's been released now. You've published it?
Yes, it is. And someone actually in the chat asked for a link, so I've just sent it. But
yeah.
Yes, it's out today, and it's been written about already. In fact, in News 24 in Africa wrote about it today. Yeah, it's been written about in various countries.
And that's fantastic. But ironically, our sense is that it's received a lot of media attention. Do you agree? And what's been the feedback coming in?
It's been astounding, Tati. I completely agree. So the first report, the one about COVID, was written about in 90 articles across 70 countries. And for me, this is really exceptionally positive on two levels. One, it shows that obviously organizations and people and newsmakers are surprised so it brings something new, but more importantly, they care. They care enough to write about it. They care enough to push the conversation forward. So it's been really amazing feedback, which I'm very excited about, because as you and I spoke about, and you've seen the talk, change really needs to happen. We need to be more creative about it. So I've been invited to many congresses and conferences by different organizations, including the UN Women, also in countries where we didn't even do the research, such as Spain. So obviously the newsmakers community is interested and wants to do something about it. I guess it's really important to move first to bring awareness and then to decide to act on it, which will involve a lot of self-reflection for us all, because we all hold biases that we often are, biased, we're unaware of our biases. And so we need to all kind of reflect on that.
Yeah, and on that note, Luba, it's been fantastic having you. We look forward to, because the work is not done.
No, but we're trying. Thank you so much for having me, and good luck. Great event.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Luba Kassova. Yeah. Kat Haber, I note your question, and I will ask it after the next speaker. I will ask it to Anatole Manzi, because I think it could go to anyone. I want to bring in Gustav Praekelt. Yeah. What
Hello. Hey, Tati.
Hey, Gustav.
How's it going?
How you doing, man? Yeah.
Nice to speak to you.
Very good. Gustav is coming in all the way from Cape Town. Yeah.
It's very far.
Very, very far. Gustav, I'm going to ask you a question that I know you have insight on, but I also know that it's not directly up your alley. I hope you can answer it. One, is the vaccine going to, how is the rolling out of the vaccine? Well, is it going to be rolled out safely? I know you have access to these answers. What insights can you share on that?
Yeah, no, and Tati, I just want to say, I thought the talk earlier today about vaccines was fantastic. And as you know, I'm a technologist, and so not a scientist. And so I think what we care very deeply about, and what my talk was about as well, is how do we provide information to people so that they can take the actions themselves that will improve their health. And so, we've been talking this whole year about COVID, and to a great extent, what we did with the WhatsApp line, the information line, was to try and provide information to people so that they could take the right actions during lockdown and social distancing and mask wearing, so that they could protect themselves. Because though it is caused by a virus, it's also very much caused by individual action. And I think with the vaccine rollout that's going to start happening next year, one part, very important part, is the science of developing vaccine, but the other part is the behavioral science part. Like how do we make sure the logistics, how do we make sure people get the vaccine, and then obviously the behavioral science part is how do we get people to actually want to take the vaccine, make sure that it gets to the right people, make sure that the right information gets to people around the vaccines. I don't know about you, but certainly from my perspective, I wonder, like, which vaccine should I take? I mean, there's so many of them. Are they safe? Aren't they safe? We open up the newspapers or Twitter, and then we hear about the Pfizer one, and we hear about the Moderna one, and we just and unless we're scientists, we don't necessarily know what the right individual action is we can take to keep ourselves and our loved ones safe. So I think that a very large part of what we all need to do as a society next year is make sure that we have the correct information, that we have it available to everybody, that everybody has got access to the vaccine that needs it, and that we stamp out any non-scientific or at least incorrect information that potentially could be harmful to other people. And so, for instance, one of the challenges we might have is that somebody that should be getting the vaccine that doesn't, who then gets infected and spreads the virus, causing harm to other people. So I think very large part of battling COVID-19 next year is going to be about information delivery and about doing that correctly. And that's what we're working with the Department of Health in South Africa, and obviously also with the World Health Organization.
Yeah, I was about to make that point that the platforms that you continue to build and you and your team continue to build, and somehow you keep reinventing them as each crisis comes up. And massive congratulations to you and Praekelt.org on that.
Thanks, Tati. Much appreciated.
Gustav, just one last point. Do you want to give us the Kelo has a question, quick one.
This is something I was going to do, because earlier on we talked about SMEs and how your platform is now being developed to help small businesses. So I think now that we have you on the line, Gustav, do you want to say one or two things about it? We'll share the information on social media, but just to make a comment on the how, the WhatsApp number, and the response so far.
I would love to. So very quickly, I think one of the large influences or impacts of COVID-19 is not just the economic impact, but not just the medical and clinical impact, but the economic impact as well. And so I think one of the really important things is how does business get affected. And so what we've done is we working together with Google, who have sponsored an information line called SMME Start that's going to be launching, has just launched actually, in a number of different territories, so South Africa, Nigeria, and in Kenya. And what it is basically going to be allowing people to do is any micro enterprise or small enterprise will be able to access to information around how to get their business started up again. And so I think that's going to be a very important part of getting our economy running, because, you know, and I thought the previous talk was so important. So many of the influences are other things. So people going hungry, people not having jobs, people not having the ability to run their businesses. So what we're going to be doing is providing information on this line that small Bs and micro enterprises can access this information. They can apply for grants, they can share information, they can create their CVs, and it'll be available in multiple languages as well. So we're very excited about that, and people will be able to access it on the WhatsApp line. So I'm happy to share that. I will post that into the, I'm just copying it here, and I'll share that on the chat line.
Thank you so much, and enjoy Cape Town.
Thank you.
All right, Gustav, thank you so much for joining us, man. And last, definitely not least, all the way from Boston, originally from Rwanda, Anatole Manzi, or Manzi to those who know him. Hello, Manzi.
Hi there.
Oh, hey, my brother, are you doing all right? Yeah. Okay, thank you so much. We know it's very early in the morning in Boston. It's probably also quite cold, you know, and we appreciate you being able to make time to connect with us and answer a few questions, but also thank you so much for the wonderful insights that you shared in your talk.
Absolutely, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to join my colleagues here.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you two questions. One of them is from Kat Haber. I hope I pronounced your surname correctly, Kat. But it's an interesting one because a lot of people have asked this question. And I wonder if maybe the answer came in bits and pieces throughout this event. But here's the question. Why is Africa so little affected relative to other continents for COVID-19? What are your thoughts? Yeah,
that's a great question, and thank you for asking, because it's really important here. You know, there's no single answer to that. So, but there's some really important elements here. One is our public health system, and being more specific, our ability to learn from the past pandemics. You see, we just came out of Ebola recently. And many countries still struggling with, you know, malaria, with you know, cholera, and you know, all of these actually built a very strong you know, system. Especially the community health system across the African continent is really robust and well structured, you know, and that actually helped with setting up, you know, the incident or emergency response teams at all levels, from the community to central ministry. And eventually that helped to minimize, you know, to send the messages and really limit, obviously, that we still have some misinformation, but at least on the African continent, the messaging has been much better than anywhere else. Obviously, that's an element of the response, but we know that there's a, you know, obviously the weather and the environmental factors that can be into play. So you all know our best climate on the African continent, even though the climate change is affecting everyone, that can be into play. So it's still, there's a lot to explore. How does the environment, the climate affect the virus, and I think there's a lot to be, you know, to be explored, but that's actually one of the hypotheses. Oh, wow. And obviously I need to also talk about the you know, the sort of the epidemiology of this. So eventually we are in a continent where people like to stay in their neighborhood and, you know, with their families, and, you know, less travels. I guess there's less flights, in-country flights, and that helps to contain, you know, whatever cases in a specific region. So there are so many other factors, but really the most important that I think we continue to have is the stronger, you know, health system, especially when it comes to messaging and communication. though I have to say this, 30, that there's still a lot of unknown because, we need to do more testing. We need to do more, asking people how they feel, and really, we still need to kind of do that incident reporting to have a better picture of what's happening. And lastly, the age. Africa has the young population, and it's really important to see that most of people who are being mostly who are being taken by this horrible pandemic are people who are really older, so the elderly population, or those who have the pre-existing conditions. So, and the Africa being a young continent, so having the youngest population, that's somehow protective.
Yeah, so there's a lot of known unknowns. Yeah,
absolutely.
And a few answers that we think might lead us somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just one other question before we let you go, Anatole. What impact, though, has the pandemic had on essential health services on the continent itself?
That's a very good question, and I think I published an article probably 1-2 months ago talking about really how this is the main challenge. As even in a pre-COVID, we had these issues of service utilization. So when you look at when you look at pre-COVID, actually 7.8 billion people lacked access to essential health services. With the COVID-19, eventually, I remember the recent report by Bill and Melinda Gates reporting that eventually the 25 weeks in the pandemic took us 25 years in terms of vaccine coverage, immunization coverage. And this is really, now imagine how many months it's been. So, when we talk about essential health services, we look at, WHO actually defined some of these essential health services in more sort of in a situation of a crisis and emergencies. Those should include reproductive health, maternal child health services, non-communicable diseases, mental health. And eventually, when you look at what's happening, we see a significant decline in service utilization. So women are not having antenatal care services. There's a significant decline. We can see a significant decline in the family planning services. And I was telling people that we should expect a baby boom, in post-COVID, or maybe even during this COVID-19, because people are not having access to family planning opportunities they need. So we need to look at this. Even sexual and gender violence increased dramatically because of COVID-19, and people are not having services they need. So when even in South Africa, when you look at HIV and TB, there have been a decline. I think it's around 33% decline in TB diagnosis. So we can see how eventually we see decline. But the other thing that means, obviously, if there's a decline in the maternal health services, let's say at health facility level, we should talk about home deliveries. And home deliveries are related, eventually directly related to increased maternal mortality. So that's exactly what we should really see is, a decline of services at health facilities, and increase poor outcomes in terms of these essential services, primarily maternal child health services, but also it's across all essential services that we normally health facilities would provide.
Yeah. Well, on yet another sobering note, and there've been a few today, hopefully we find answers to many of these questions. Hopefully we find solutions to many of these problems. Thank you so much for joining us, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, and I'm really excited that you are setting a platform for us to share some of the practices needed to, for us to mitigate the pandemic.
Yeah. All right, my brother. Take care. Keep warm.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. I just want to, I think on this awesome note, we're not the only TEDx Johannesburg volunteers. There are many others. We just want to say thank you for joining us, to everyone who attended. We look forward to posting the talk in the coming weeks. Hopefully at TED, they keep the office going throughout the Christmas, but no, they're going to take a break. So a few of the talks will be posted before, and a few of the others will be posted after the Christmas break. But thank you so much for joining us, people. TEDx Johannesburg, surviving pandemics, signing off. Cheers.
Thank you, and have a safe and blessed holiday. Bye.
Till next time. Cheers.
Cheers.